Hello everyone and welcome to day 2 of the Nature for Life Hub. I'm Victoria Bergeniuk, your host for today's journey. Our focus today revolves around creating a new green economy. Today we're reflecting on how we can rethink our economy from the ground up, redirect the forces that shape our economy, and transform our businesses and financial institutions into a force for a nature-positive future. In our first session, we'll explore nature-based solutions and nature-positive policies that set us on a path to a new green economy. Later, we'll explore how we can deliver a nature-positive economy through business and finance. To get started, let's hear from youth activist Elizabeth Gulugulu about the need to shift towards a nature-positive economy. Afterwards, we'll hear from Midori Paxton about the need to move beyond the mindset that there is a trade-off between people and the planet. There doesn't have to be.
The question is no longer, can I afford this? The question is, can our planet afford to produce this? Can our planet afford to produce this for at least the next 7 generations to come? Right now, our economic and business models imperil life on Earth, including our own. The linear take-make-waste model must stop. Obscured supply chains that businesses don't take responsibility for must stop. The loss of biodiversity, which imperils half of global GDP, must stop. We have come to the end of the road of unfettered growth, of business that simply takes and does not give back. The solutions we have to choose must be good for people, good for economies, and good for the planet.
It's about energy. It's about rethinking the operating system itself. We have a fantastic opportunity to open new perspectives and new horizons. Instead of remaining trapped in the frustrations of the present, with creativity and innovation, we really can rethink and redesign our future.
As a representative of a global corporation,
we would like to join our voices today to issue a warning and make a commitment.
Global commodity trade has already altered 1/3 of the world's land surface for agriculture. Production of commodities continues to trigger habitat loss, degradation and fragmentation, driving species to extinction and destroying the livelihoods of communities who depend on ecosystems for their livelihoods.
We need to rethink the way we produce and consume our food, our clothes, our cosmetics. Continuing with business as usual is not an option if we want to solve our planetary crises and achieve shared prosperity.
If we accept that the living world's cyclical model works, can we change our way of thinking so that we too operate a circular economy? Let's start with the biological cycle. How can our waste build capital rather than reduce it? By rethinking and redesigning products and components, and the packaging they come in, we can create safe and compostable materials that help grow more stuff.
Indigenous and community-led businesses hold the key for a green and inclusive recovery.
We are beginning to see how we will encourage natural resources to be utilized instead of plastics and nylon that have taken over most of these things.
Gbogbo ènìyàn tó bá ní ìdí rẹ̀ la máa ń tà fún. Àwọn kan wà wọ́n máa ń fi ń ṣènáwó, àwọn tó fi ń ta ọjà, àwọn tó ń lò nínú ilé fúnra ara wọn, tó fi ń ṣoúnjẹ fúnra ara wọn. So gbogbo ẹni tó nífẹ̀ẹ́ sí náà la máa ń tà.
The circular economy isn't about one manufacturer changing one product. It's about all the interconnecting companies that form our infrastructure and economy coming together.
The reason for working with the Dutch Iron Custodians was we saw a very unique opportunity and something that the industry has never seen in regards to sandalwood in Australia before. is that business relationship, the wild resource out in the bush, where the indigenous cultures have really respected this tree for many thousands of years, and then being married up with the plantation industry, which has now got a renewable resource and is investment driven, so it's a perfect fit.
Progress for our planet means putting communities at the heart of sustainable supply chains. We should never forget that nature is our most abundant economy. Creating a truly green economy means creating an economy that can weather all storms and can regenerate our future.
Do you believe there is a conflict between economic development and nature conservation?
A false dichotomy that environmental and economic imperatives are in opposition. We have created a totally unsustainable production and consumption system that ignores the basic limits to growth. Because money is invested in actions that causes harm and destruction to nature, nature's values and services remain invisible in economic and financial calculus. And because there is no serious penalty in destroying nature for private gain, although it means theft of our heritage and lifeline.
It's time to act now. Join the conversation. Make a difference. Be part of the change we all need.
In this first segment, we're delving into nature-based solutions, actions that protect, restore, and manage nature while also providing essential services for humanity. We'll explore why nature-based solutions are so important for sustaining jobs, livelihoods, and well-being in the segment Nature-Based Solutions for Prosperity. We'll also look at how nature is supporting pathways to prosperity all around the world. Let's get started.
Rampant wildfires, mass flooding, extreme temperatures. We are witnessing a planetary crisis unfold in real time, and every passing moment reveals a more pressing need for change. But where there is a problem, there is a solution. And when it comes to tackling the climate crisis, nature is our greatest ally. It's time we recognize its value. This is where nature-based solutions come into play. But what exactly do those look like? Nature-based solutions are all about working with nature instead of against nature. When we champion nature-based solutions, we all benefit from the results they provide for the issues facing our planet. Take mangroves, for example. If all mangroves were lost or destroyed, 15 million more people would be affected by floods across the world each year. This means mangrove forests not only provide habitats for fish, they also provide protective natural barriers and solutions against strong storms, floods, and erosion. They filter water, provide food and timber resources to coastal communities, and can store huge amounts of carbon. Conserving and restoring these ecosystems allows people and nature to thrive, all the while reducing risks posed by the climate crisis. By working with nature like this and changing how we use land, researchers estimate we can reduce emissions by up to a third of what's needed to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. And mangroves aren't alone in their value. Other ecosystems also offer incredible solutions to issues we may not even think about, such as coral reefs. whose ability to reduce the intensity of waves is crucial to shielding tens of millions of people from floods. Some studies actually suggest they can be even more effective than human-built breakwaters at this task, or grasslands and savannas, which provide homes for wildlife and help capture and store carbon. The natural world does so much to sustain and protect us and all those we share this planet with. We must do the same in return, and we must do it now. Nature-based solutions are a win-win for each and every one of us, and it's time we pay attention to them.
Mire, nosotros quemamos, le voy a decir por qué. Porque como la maleza es muy gruesa, pasamos tan palos gruesos, no se puede sembrar así entre la basura, ¿no? Entonces se quema para que quede limpia la tierra, ¿no? Yo sé que se va deteriorando la tierra. Se lava, la flor de la tierra se pierde. Yo entiendo eso. Pero no tenemos otra opción para poder sembrar. ¿Me entiende?
Scenes of slash and burn like these are common throughout the human tropics. A century or more ago, these landscapes were covered with tropical rainforest. Today, views like these, degraded to the furthest horizons, are prevalent throughout the tropics. Recent estimates put land use change as contributing between 1 and 2 billion tons of carbon into the atmosphere annually. Slash and burn is the major component of this, around 15% of all emissions, on the same scale as all global transport combined. Slash and burn is not an agricultural system. It is a consumptive process.
Vamos botamos dos manzanas aquí, ya el otro año botamos en otro lado, botamos así para allá para sembrar las milpas, para sembrar los frijoles, lo mismo. Entonces nosotros sembramos lo que nosotros podemos acá.
Nutrients in the soil deplete fast, and within a couple of years, yields drop dramatically. Farmers are forced to add expensive fertilizers and then noxious pesticides to kill off weeds, fighting a losing battle. Eventually, they're forced to clear yet more forest and begin once again. Yet a little-known solution is changing all of this. Alley cropping with the tree genus Inga turns the problem on its head. This fast-growing tree is planted along the contours of the land in hedgerows. In a matter of months, they grow to form a canopy, shading out most of the weed growth. At the appropriate time, they're pruned back to about chest height, and the leaves are stripped to form a thick carpet of mulch. Adding crude rock phosphate kickstarts the refertilization of the soils. While protecting the soils, the mulch is also breaking down, providing nutrition to the crops growing beneath it.
Mire, esta es la ciencia de esta papada. Mire cómo los hongos están ahí, haciendo posible la descomposición del rastrojo.
While securing the soils, the trees are also retaining and recycling other key nutrients.
Mire, en estas pequeñas papitas que se llaman nódulos, existen bacterias. Bacterias que hacen posible jalar el nitrógeno atmosférico del espacio y fijarlo en la planta de guama.
Aggressive grasses and weeds require extensive herbicides and back-breaking work to control. Those that make it through the mulch in alley cropping, however, are easily dealt with.
Bien fácil arrancar.
Wood from the pruning of the trees makes an excellent and constant source of firewood. Apart from the benefits between basic crops grown without and with this system, more valuable and wholly organic cash crops also flourish within it, including black pepper, harvested and ground by the farmers themselves. Yet the list is growing, including turmeric, cacao, pineapple, and now even vanilla. The system's resilience has amazed everyone involved. A major storm hit in 2016, dumping 195 millimeters of rain in 18 hours and raising rivers by 40 feet. While conventional farming crops were stripped off the hillsides, the mulch and tree roots protected crops and soils. Moreover, in an extreme 8-month drought that followed, the moisture captured under the mulch sustained the crops throughout. Alley cropping frees up land held by families in reserve for future slash and burn. Once food security has been achieved, the Inga model combines 4 components: 2 plots for basic grains and cash crops, with another 2 for reforestation. The results are striking. A mere 3 years has transformed this plot from a naked hillside to what appears to be a forest. Yet beneath the canopy of Inga, cash crops are flourishing.
Pues estaba pensando que en ese cajón queda bonito. Si lograra reforestar toda esta parte, entre ellas parte de frutales, madera, como decir cacao.
Using Inga alley cropping to stop and reverse slash and burn can avoid the emissions of and simultaneously sequester huge amounts of carbon, rising over a 12-year period to over 150 tons per 8-hectare holding per family. The Inga model fulfills 11 of the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals, with no negative impacts on the remaining 6. Help us work together to bring Inga Foundation to the world.
Hay de los viejos ahí que tienen como 30 metros.
Son cosas que uno sabe por los abuelitos de uno.
Qué bello que usted venga retomando eso que nosotros conocimos antes.
Proyecto que la gente vuelva a esa cultura ancestral.
Allá donde yo vivo hay unos árboles de esos viejos que están vivos.
Sí lo había ido a nombrar, pero no sabían todo el proceso que se hacía con él.
Y hoy que retoman ustedes el programa nuevamente con el bálsamo de Tolú, pues me parece maravilloso. De pronto ojalá y se pueda rehabilitar mucha madera de bálsamo de Tolú, que sería maravilloso continuar con repoblamiento.
Un tesoro perdido en sus parcelas y no lo sabían con exactitud. La verdad es que hay esperanza.
Dar a conocer a nuevas generaciones que desconocen esto. Que ese árbol es el futuro.
En la Navidad.
Nunca se acaba. Y eso va a tener un ejército grande, ese bálsamo.
Cerita-cerita dari leluhur kami mengakui bahwa orang utan itu asalnya dari manusia. Mereka pergi, tinggal di hutan yang lebat. Orang Dayak sudah lama bertani menanam rotan. Rotan sangat sakral untuk orang Dayak dan juga dipakai untuk kebutuhan sehari-hari. dan rotan itu dia menghasilkan banyak bahan. Dia punya kulit, dia punya tengah, dan dia juga bisa digunakan dengan adanya seperti itu. Hubungan pohon dan rotan itu sangat erat. Rotan tidak bisa hidup tanpa adanya pohon. Sedangkan kami orang Dayak tidak bisa hidup lepas dari hutan. Kita sudah membentuk koperasi untuk bisa mengolah rotan secara berkelanjutan dan mencari pasar. Dibantu oleh WWF dan IKEA hingga kita mendapatkan sertifikasi FSC, dan kami juga mendapat sertifikat tanah supaya tidak dialihfungsikan untuk hal-hal yang lain. Kalau kita tidak menjaga hutan, kita tidak menjaga orang hutan. Kita harus mempertahankan hutan supaya nanti anak cucu kita masih bisa menikmati dengan adanya hutan.
Muchas gracias por este tiempo. Ahora nos encontramos con John Edison Goyo. Él es representante de la organización del Parque de la Papa, a quien le damos la bienvenida y quien nos va a comentar de lo que realizan en el Parque de la Papa en el tema de cuidado del medio ambiente. John, por favor, si te puedes presentar.
Bueno, hermanas y hermanas, buenas noches. Primeramente agradecer por esta invitación y también darte un saludo a nombre de la Asociación de Comunidades del Parque La Papa. Mi nombre es John, soy de la comunidad de Amaro, que pertenece al Parque La Papa. Parque La Papa pues está ubicado en departamento Cusco, provincia Calca, distrito Pisac. Pisac, las comunidades parte alta. Parte alta son 6 comunidades y parte baja son 6 comunidades. Total abarca 12 comunidades en el parque, en el distrito Pisac, y parte alta 6 comunidades. Entonces el Parque La Papa, pues gracias a esta organización estamos conservando muchas diversidades de papas nativas, no solamente papas, lo que son otros productos, ¿no? Lo que son cereales o tubérculos, el pariente de la papa, ¿no? El oca, masmo o yuco. Entonces, eso es el trabajo del Parque La Papa, gracias a nuestro consejo directivo, que está representando a nuestro compañero Santo Sanco, que es el presidente del Parque La Papa. A nombre de ellos saludarles y gracias.
Muchas gracias, John. Tengo unas preguntas para ti. ¿Cómo ha ayudado los conocimientos tradicionales de su comunidad a adaptarse a las condiciones climáticas que están cambiando a lo largo de generaciones?
Bueno, en lo que son los cambios climáticos, no solamente en el Parque La Papa, sino casi en todo el mundo está pasando el cambio climático, ¿no? Y obviamente nosotros nos estamos adaptando gracias a Asociación Andes, que también han tomado la iniciativa con lo que son adaptarnos, ¿no? A lo que son los cambios. Y dentro del Parque La Papa tenemos pues el conocimiento andino tradicional de los sabios andinos, y también de otra parte tenemos el conocimiento científico, ¿no? Uso de la tecnología, ¿no? Hacemos un intercambio con Asociación Andes y con Parque La Papa. Entonces actualmente pues la idea del Parque La Papa es pues concientizar a los compañeros en la comunidad y también adaptarnos, ¿no? Con los cambios que estamos pasando año tras año, ¿no? Y respecto de los cambios que se está causándose en el Parque La Papa, son pues lo que son los cambios, la granizada, la helada, no son a su tiempo, ¿no? Y también los indicadores biológicos ya no nos indica tal como debe ser, ¿no? Porque por el cambio climático ya los animales ya un poco desaparecen, también las plantas, pero siempre como Parque La Papa estamos conservando lo que tenemos, ¿no? Los fundamentos más principales, los tres ayllus, ¿no? Siempre estamos conectados, trabajando con ellos para así poder afrontar lo que son los cambios que tenemos en el Parque La Papa.
Muchas gracias. ¿Y cómo pueden las personas y organizaciones que no son parte de la comunidad apoyar a las iniciativas que ustedes tienen sobre el tema del clima y defender la justicia climática?
Mayormente lo que son los hermanos que están en otros lugares o distritos, departamentos, comunidades, siempre vienen al Parque La Papa a ver cómo nosotros conservamos y cómo también estamos haciendo lo que son investigaciones al cambio climático, adaptaciones de diferentes productos que tenemos en el Parque La Papa. Hemos creado escuelas de campos en cada comunidad, ¿no? Mayormente no estamos trabajando todos en el parque, siempre hay hermanos y hermanas que están migrando a diferentes lugares, pero ellos siempre vuelven, llegan. Entonces, la idea es formar grupos de personas como escuelas de campo en las comunidades, en cada comunidad de 30 a 40 personas, que ahí hablamos de los cambios climáticos, ¿no? Ya transmitimos, ¿no? Lo que nosotros estamos trabajando, adaptando. Entonces, de esa forma, ellos también cuando van a sus pueblos, a sus distritos, ya empiezan a concientizar, a comentar, ¿no? El trabajo del Parque La Papa.
Ujú. ¿Y qué otras estrategias están empleando ustedes para educar a los más jóvenes dentro de la comunidad sobre el tema que ustedes manejan de cuidado de medio ambiente y el cambio climático?
Mayormente respecto de lo que son eh, a los jóvenes, estamos pues concientizando, capacitando en lo que es la conservación de papas nativas, en adaptación de papas, ¿no? De poder trabajar, identificar las variedades de papas nativas que son resistentes al cambio climático, ¿no? Por ejemplo, durante estos años con lo que son investigaciones, hemos hecho adaptación de una variedad de papa que es el papa rookie, ¿no? Que es resistente a la helada, a la granizada, ¿no? De esa forma ellos también van a seguir trabajando lo que son cultivos en el campo, ¿no? Y también vamos a estar eh, impulsando lo que es el turismo, ¿no? De esa forma para poder conservar las diversidades que tenemos, las reservas genéticas que tenemos en el Parque La Papa, ¿no? Entonces, mayormente si nosotros incluimos el turismo, trabajamos junto con el turismo, con los hermanos que nos visitan, con el ingreso que ellos pagan, vamos a estar siempre en nuestra comunidad de poder conservar lo que nosotros trabajamos en el Parque La Papa.
Ujú. Y ahora de cara al futuro, pensando en el futuro, ¿cuál es la visión que tiene la comunidad en relación a todos estos cambios que se están generando? ¿Qué
Eh,
legado desean dejar a las generaciones que vienen?
Eh, durante este año que el Parque La Papa comenzamos a trabajar, ¿no? Gracias a La Papa nos hemos juntado varias comunidades. Es una historia, ¿no? Que ya vivimos casi 25 años con esta organización del Parque La Papa desde años de 1998. Desde ese año estamos trabajando, ¿no? En el Parque La Papa y también juntamente con los compañeros de la comunidad, ¿no? Que somos la comunidad Chawaitire, Pampallacta, Paru Paru, Amaro, después Sacaca, Cuyurán, de estas comunidades pertenecen. Entonces, nosotros como Parque La Papa, para la futura generación que viene, gracias a esta organización Conocimiento Científica, Asociación Andes y también Conocimiento Andina Tradicional, hemos hecho un intercambio de experiencia y también hemos tenido conversaciones con el Centro Internacional de Papas, CIP, en Lima, para poder tener no semillas en tubérculo, sino tener en semillas botánicas, ¿no? Que es el fruto de la papa, extraemos estas semillas botánicas. Entonces nosotros, con esa ayuda de Centro Internacional de Papa, Parque La Papa y Asociación Andes, hemos obtenido 750 semillas botánicas, ¿no? Que actualmente tenemos las tres copias, uno en copia en el Parque La Papa, uno tenemos en el Centro Internacional de Papa en Lima, y uno tenemos Svalbard en Noriega. Ahí tenemos en Banco Mundial, ¿no? Las semillas, las 750 semillas botánicas, ¿no? Para la futura generación que viene. Pues, como sabemos que muchos hermanos o sabios andinos nos comentan que la planeta va a desaparecer o también va a haber fin del mundo, de acuerdo a las escrituras que hay, ¿no? Las bíblicas que nos cuentan, y por eso nosotros con la organización del Parque La Papa hemos llevado estas semillas para la futura generación que viene, para tener la reserva, la preserva, ¿no? No solamente pensando en el Parque La Papa, no solamente en el Perú, sino a nivel mundial, ¿no? Trayecto de cambios climáticos, quién sabe que si nosotros todos desapareceremos, ahí está en el banco de semillas, nuestras semillas, y como arca de Noé, ¿no? Entonces ahí está depositada nuestras semillas botánicas. Y que queremos, ¿no? Trabajar más y más, porque en el Perú tenemos pues más de 3.500 variedades de papas nativas. Sería un placer de tener más semillas botánicas con el apoyo que tal vez habría, ¿no? De diferentes hermanos para poder obtener estas semillas. Para obtener estas semillas botánicas ha sido pues un largo tiempo, ¿no? Porque teníamos que investigar cada fruto, cada baya de la papa, ¿no? Si está bien, si puede producir o no. Es una investigación que dura 4 o 5 años. Entonces, así hemos trabajado como Parque La Papa, ¿no? O pensando en nuestros hijos que vienen.
Ujú. Muchas gracias, John, por compartir toda esta experiencia que ustedes tienen dentro del Parque de la Papa. Estamos muy agradecidos de que compartas este tiempo. Bueno, nos despedimos entonces con esta pregunta. Gracias.
Gracias, hermanas y hermanos. Esto es el trabajo del Parque La Papa que estamos haciendo día a día. Nosotros como conservadores de la papa o como guardianes de la papa, seguiremos trabajando, conservando las diversidades que tenemos en el Parque La Papa. Y también agradecer G-Adventure, Planetera, que también nos apoyan en lo que son, que vienen de promocionar el Parque La Papa, que nos visitan los hermanos de diferentes lugares, ¿no? De esa forma tenemos el ingreso al Parque La Papa ya para poder conservar las diversidades de papas. Entonces ya nos genera un trabajo en el Parque La Papa, ya no necesitamos de nuestros gobiernos o municipios, sino pues gracias, ¿no? Que esta iniciativa que siga adelante y que nos siga apoyando, ¿no? En lo que es en la organización, en la conservación. Gracias, hermanos y hermanas. Estoy muy agradecido de poder compartir la experiencia del Parque La Papa.
Muchas gracias. Hasta la próxima.
Trapping bus for Jumano Mudiabana. Media many of us will be brave. say me worker wɔ nursery hɔ agro-forest no nso me sign wɔ mu even me fie kura me nua bi so sign wɔ mu a ɔyɛ fire volunteer ti ɔmo boa me de mani agye ɔmo adwuma na ɔmo de aba no ho paa mani agye ho enti sɛ bi wɔ hɔ bie mu kura ɔmo sign famra ye be so ma mo
anya fa so bebree fi training Trucking Boss Ghana and GIZ for Eddie my no so bebree we kwani am dua no ba bebree me dua cashew bayre banche cabbage nyadoa na mako ani adwuma titiro a me ye pa na inside training Trucking Boss Ghana and GIZ de bre no ashim kuma ma fi metumi dua be se 3 hectares omo ankasa emwa ewom 2 hectares omo ma me nua ba no free nti no hye mi nkura na mai ma se me dua be na nka me ntumi nua ye training ne mo de mai no de na nka me ntumi start ti me nya paso afi won so bebre
zet any traveling board omo ba bato no on be boy ti se me ne nana de dika no won be sre asasi ene di mai na ye twa asase no ma wo no wo mo fa mbabunu enipa dodo a wo mo ye adwuma e wo asase no so na adwuma no gugu ahodo ye kura asase no so ansa na eduae endua ye betimi dia hibidie daachi ye dua so ye sene do mu a enipa dodo no edo so metimi akase wo mpro nipa wo hakura a wo mo twa wo nyina eka na de ni je wo mu ni sei o mi ehun sei enua adwuma ye no se nyame bo na se adwuma ne ye a e kuro we adea a nde kura ye pese ebe ye kura enka wo mu sai mra na ensa ma o mi babu no mfa mbabu no sai nka ho ne ye adwuma ne bibio fi se obi a okọ adwuma no bia no wonya bibi kakra edifree sa adwuma ye nim o mu se kire se ndua nso ebe ye de nti ma ya nije ewo sa GIZ any traveling board so adwuma de ya mo de baba otokuma no.
In 2005, Kailash Satyarthi Children's Foundation, formerly Bachpan Bachao Andolan, was funded by Aveda and the Estee Lauder companies to work in the Indian states of Bihar and Jharkhand to find solutions for eliminating child labor in mica mining, involving more than 20,000 children, often earning less than $1 a day, in an area where mica mining is often the only source of income for families. Mica is a mineral used widely in paints, cosmetics, and electrical equipment. In the many mica mining villages we visited in 2005, no person had ever been to school and there were no functional schools. Listening to the communities in the first 9 villages, we realized that before work against child labor could be started, the community's most critical need had to be met. The critical need was access to clean water, as they were drinking from polluted rivers in mica mines. Alongside starting work to find community solutions to eliminate child labor, hand pumps were installed in the first 9 villages. In India, access to water is available through many government programs, but we were told that no government official had been able to visit the mica areas for over 17 years due to major security issues. External funding for water program was needed. Whilst hand pumps were being installed, schools had to be built and staffed. Often, they were simple yet functional non-formal education centers. There were few, if any, roads, and travel was often dangerous due to security reasons. Lasting change must come about through community decision-making. Yet, adult villagers were nervous to raise their voices. They were often in debt bondage to the mica traders and mine operators. After 2 years of research, it was decided together with the community, that child-friendly villages would be formed. In these villages, there is no child labor, child trafficking, or child marriages. All children receive a meaningful and quality education. Child leadership is established through Bal Panchayat or Children's Council. The Children's Council is recognized by the Gram Panchayat or the Village Council. Empowered communities, women and youth groups, and marginalized and vulnerable sections of society help in child protection and village development. Children soon began to understand their rights, including the right to education. They were also made aware of the government programs for availing access to clean water. The children started to speak out, and later the voices of the adult community in the villages also became eminent. As the number of child-friendly villages rose from 9 in 2007 to 500 plus in 2022, the security issues also reduced. Government programs were accessed by the community, from building and repairing schools to access to water programs to roads, new houses and electricity. Access to government food ration trucks was also essential for the many below poverty line persons. Access to school needed to go hand in hand with access to water in the nearby areas for the children and their families. Often a barrier for girls to attend school was that they spent much of their time collecting and carrying water for large distances and therefore could not attend school. Until 2021, funding from Aveda was important for the installation of water facilities and funding major access to water, sanitation and health community awareness programs in hundreds of villages. Now in 2023, external funding for water programs is only needed in the most remote areas, where the government programs at this moment in time are often unable to access.
पहले हम लोग बहुत यहाँ नदी नाला का पानी पीते थे, बच्चा लोग बीमार हो जाते थे और बच्चा बीमार करने हो जाता था तो इलाज करने के लिए हम लोग को यहाँ पर डॉक्टर कहीं का व्यवस्था नहीं था। इसलिए अब जल योजना लग गया है तो पानी पीने के लिए शुद्ध पानी मिलता है और अब से कम हम बीमार होते हैं।
Aveda and Estee Lauder companies funded and facilitated the installation and repair of over 1,900 hand pumps, deep bore wells, ponds, pipelines, water tanks, reverse osmosis filtration systems, rainwater harvesting systems, benefiting over 300,000 people. Mica mining is often done in the forest, where the mica-dependent villagers are often tribal and have cared for the forest for thousands of years. A major challenge to the forests, apart from illegal mica mining, was the collection of firewood. Now, liquefied petroleum gas cylinders and gas stoves are being supplied to families to reduce the need for firewood and help preserve the forests.
मैं इसी जंगल में पली बड़ी हूँ और यहाँ के जानवर और हम साथ साथ रहते हैं और अब हाथी भी वापस आ रहे हैं.
This work is multi-dimensional in approach and partners from children, community, block and district to federal partners being facilitated by KSCF.
पहले नदी का पानी पीते थे तो डायरिया का शिकायत होता था, आरओ लग गया तो हम लोग को अब डायरिया का शिकायत नहीं होता है। स्कूल में भी बच्चे पानी पी रहे हैं और कुछ गांव का भी पी रहे हैं, साफ पानी मिलता है तो हम लोग अब अच्छा जिंदगी जी पा रहे हैं।
KSCF now has 684 child-friendly villages in all mica-dependent regions, and in late 2023, this work will protect all children in these villages from working in the mica mines or other forms of exploitation.
We've seen how nature can be one of our greatest allies when it comes to supporting prosperity and well-being. Nature is also one of our greatest allies when it comes to tackling our climate crisis. Let's explore the different ways that working with nature can help sequester carbon and build resilient communities. Let's listen in.
adaptation. It's in our DNA. We run into a challenge, we learn to overcome it.
For the first flight on record.
We explore, experiment, and evolve. But how do we adapt to the defining crisis of our time? Right now, climate change is threatening our lives and livelihoods.
This is a climate emergency.
In the Northeast, freak flooding.
With so much at risk, we can't afford not to adapt.
Pakistan is underwater.
Climate adaptation is how people are taking action to adjust to the changes we see and the impacts we feel as the Earth grows warmer. Rising temperatures, extreme weather, food and water insecurity.
The poorest people that were least responsible for causing climate change are those paying most of the consequences.
We must reduce emissions, remove carbon from the atmosphere, and adapt to the impacts that are already here. And for all of that, nature is our greatest ally. Mangroves protect coastal communities from storm surges while trapping tons of carbon. Forests prevent landslides caused by heavy rains and the thaw of frozen ground. Wetlands capture rain and store it for times of drought. Healthy ecosystems on land and sea support an abundance of life and an abundance of food sources for us. When nature thrives, we all thrive. But unless we protect nature, we won't have a stable climate or the ally we need to help humanity adapt to changes. We have to recognize that nature is part of the solution right now.
Farmers can adapt to climate change by using more drought-resistant varieties or plant more trees in croplands to improve soil fertility, provide shade, and diversify agricultural production with fruits and timber. Mountain communities can protect vegetation on slopes that, with their roots, can stabilize the soil and reduce the erosion and landslide risk due to heavy rainfall. Pastoralists in increasingly dry areas help restoring grassland by removing invasive algae species that are using a lot of water.
Conserving critical ecosystems, forests, rangelands, oceans, mangroves, rivers, and wetlands will help us mitigate the worst impacts of climate change and adapt to the changes that are already here.
If not us, then who?
Menurut kita kehidupan kebersamaan di rumah panjang ini, ya ini adalah bukan mulai sekarang, tapi itu dari turun temurun sampai hari ini. Kehidupan kebersamaan, ya, rasa solidaritas itu.
Rumah panjang memang itulah jiwa kekeluargaan tuh masih kuat.
Masyarakat di sini sering kerjasama di dalam keadaan susah dan senang.
Apabila tidak ada satu kesatuan di antara mereka, semua hutan dan wilayah kita ini bisa habis bekerja dalam sekelip mata.
Hutan itu sangat penting. Soalnya di dalam hutan itu banyak sekali yang bisa kita, kalau ada sisa dipakai bisa juga untuk dijual, penunjang ekonomi.
hutan itu dengan masyarakat di sini itu jadi kawan. Jadi ya jadi kawan itu hutan membantu masyarakat itu, masyarakat tuh membantu hutan menyelamatkan.
Ya kalau hutan kita masih bagus, masih utuh seperti ini, semua binatang juga, ikan juga masih ada. Kita sih berterima kasih karena orang tua dulu sudah menahankan hutan. Pak Janggut juga banyak cerita dengan kita yang baru ini. Tolong dia bilang, dan pesan dia juga harus melakukan seperti ini agar hutan kita tidak dibabat oleh company gitu ya, atau perusahaan.
Kedekatan saya dengan hutan itu karena itu tadi belajar dari kakek nenek. Kami Sungai Utik ini mulai perjuangan, saya nak bilang lain, mulai tebang hutan kami demo, Umi Raya kami demo, PT itu Tangerang kami demo. Itu orang membuat patok-patok hutan lindung kami demo. Orang seperti itu cukup jelek, Pak.
Sudah itu ada perusahaan lagi akan membuka lahan sawit. Kami tolak juga, tidak mau. Semua ya perusahaan akan masuk di daerah ini, kalau nak tujuan bagi kami tolak semua. Tapi kita masih bukan tidak mau uang, tapi kita ingin lebih, kalau wilayah ini selamat dan tidak ada yang suatu konsesi yang masuk di sini, dan kemudian kita di sini alamnya masih luas, kemudian kita mau keperluan sehari-hari misalnya untuk sayur kita tinggal petik saja, untuk keperluan apa kita berburu binatang sesuai dengan keperluan kita saja, tidak berlebih. Jadi ini sangat apa yang memuatkan kita untuk mempertahankan hutan ini, karena semuanya ada di hutan, itu yang memperkuatkan kita.
Kebutuhan sehari-hari itu, untuk kebutuhan sehari-hari itu sangat penting bagi masyarakat Iban. Kalau cuaca lagi bagus, curah hujan, curah panas stabil, hasil padi itu akan banyak. Apabila curah hujan tidak stabil, maka hasilnya kayak tahun ini kurang memuaskan. Cuaca ini kita tidak bisa prediksikan lagi, tidak sama dengan tahun-tahun yang lalu lagi. Ya kalau cuacanya memang kayak begini, bisa terjadi kelaparan.
Kalau kita melihat sekarang ini dengan perubahan iklim, jadi masyarakat susah memprediksi itu kapan saatnya cocok mulai menanam, dan kemudian kapan saatnya kita buah-buahan itu bisa tumbuh, bisa berbunga. Tapi itu memang adalah tantangan yang biasa untuk kita, karena kita telah lalui berbagai macam rintangan selama ini.
Petai itu ditanam masyarakat itu sekitar 30 batang satu tahun. Jadi garu ini 1.000 satu bilik untuk menggantikan yang sudah dibabat masyarakat itu. Menjadi bekal ladang itu dikembalikan dengan ini.
Saya katakan bersahabat karena kehidupan kita sehari-hari itu berada di hutan. Jadi ini adalah hutan, kalau kita berbuat baik dengan dia, dan dia akan membantu kita kembali. Jadi itu salah satu yang rasa syukur kita punya daerah ini. Nah, itu yang perlu kita jaga. Ini yang kita harapkan pada seluruh Indonesia, dan kemudian seluruh penduduk yang punya alam yang masih bagus. Ya, kita sama-sama melestarikan kehidupan hutan dan manusia, kehidupan manusia juga sangat-sangat kita perlu.
Hello, my name is Mami Mizutori and I am the Special Representative of the United Nations Secretary General for Disaster Risk Reduction and Head of the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. Today, I want to answer 3 key questions on the role nature plays in disaster risk reduction. Well, for years, nature has been unfairly targeted as the cause of disasters, and the label of natural disasters can provide an escape for humanity's own culpability. While many hazards are indeed natural, it depends to a large extent on our actions as humans if they will become disasters, impacting people's lives and livelihoods. The decisions we make and the actions we take matters. In particular, biodiversity loss, poor environmental management, and ecosystem degradation drive disaster risk by reducing our resilience to natural hazards. This is exacerbated by climate change, but we still see a world that prefers to sacrifice nature for short-term gains over long-term sustainability and resilience. Human activities have contributed to the alteration of 75% of land surface and the loss of 85% of wetlands area. Moreover, 30% of the world's mangrove forests have been destroyed. We see biodiversity and ecosystems declining at an unprecedented rate, which puts human existence in danger. At the same time, if we take care of nature and keep ecosystems healthy, they can contribute to mitigating hazards and buffering disaster impacts. For instance, the Dasgupta Review, an independent global review on the economics of biodiversity, found that during Hurricane Sandy in 2012, an estimated $625 million in flood damages were avoided because of wetlands. This is why we must promote a systemic approach to disaster risk reduction, which includes working with nature to achieve long-term resilience. Most prominently, UNDRR advocates for the deployment of nature-based solutions as an effective way to build long-term resilience and achieve mutually reinforcing benefits. This includes positive outcomes such as increasing climate resilience, protecting water resources, improving livelihoods, and of course, reducing disaster risks. We know that integrating nature into risk management works. Indeed, mangroves are an often cited example of a nature-based solution that protects coastal regions from erosion and storms. There are many other examples as well, such as wetlands for flood protection and water purification, forest covers to reduce the incidence and impact of landslides, or green and hybrid green-gray infrastructure solutions for climate adaptation and increased urban resilience. It's critical to think of nature-based solutions as a host of measures that can be taken, often in combination with each other. A good example in the realm of resilient infrastructure is that of Canada's Natural Infrastructure Fund, which is investing 200 million Canadian dollars in nature-based solutions. Projects include wetland creation, restoration and conservation, sustainable urban drainage systems, beach and dune nourishment, as well as hybrid approaches that can reduce stress on grey infrastructure. I also want to emphasize that an all-of-government and whole-of-society approach are key to the success. In Canada, sectoral agencies collaborate to ensure coherence in policy and implementation, and engineers, scientists, and Indigenous rights holders participate in developing real-world pilot projects through living laboratories. And in the Lukaya Basin, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, bringing different stakeholders together in the planning and execution process was central for the success of ecosystem-based measures to restore slopes and mitigate hazards such as gully erosion and floods. One of the areas we urgently need to address is how to translate the ambition agreed at the global level through the Sustainable Development Goals, the Sendai Framework, the Paris Agreement, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, and other agreements into scalable solutions that have the positive impact we would like to see for people and planet. The UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction advocates that countries embrace a comprehensive approach to addressing, governing, and managing risks. This means breaking down silos between climate, environmental, and disaster domains through integrated policies, budgets, and plans, including at the local level. For example, many national climate and disaster risk reduction plans acknowledge the role of nature, but how often is work on common priorities between sectors synchronized or integrated? And are the right parts of government and society the most affected and at-risk persons involved? Partnering with nature is an essential ingredient for the transformative change we need for a coherent approach that can save costs, minimize duplication, and accelerate mutual benefits.
Le WWF au Nord Kivu réalise un projet de reboisement pour lutter contre la déforestation. Et c'est là depuis 2007. Mais à ce projet de reboisement, nous avons aussi inséré un autre projet pour la cuisson, le biogaz.
Kwa hii biogaz yangu mimi napika kako bisamu na virai na mimi napika na nyama, mimi nasonga na bugari kwa hii biogaz yangu. Dakika mingi ni dakika 5. Inatumika na maji ya ng'ombe na maji. Siuze makala, ya makala vilishaisha 10. Mimi siuze makala. Mimi naambia wewe walinisaidia kuniletea ile show. Nilikuwa nakosa makuta za kusomesha watoto wangu zenye ningeuza makala mimi naanza kusomesha watoto wangu.
L'objectif de tous ces projets, c'est de réduire la consommation du charbon de bois parce que 116 000 tonnes est utilisé dans la ville de Goma et 56% vient du parc. Alors ce projet de biogaz répond non seulement à la cuisson, mais aussi permet aux ménages d'utiliser l'engrais dans les jardins permanents.
Hii mboleo mimi natoshaka mule ile mtungi biogaz nikisha tosha mule mimi nakuya mimi namimilia mumboga. Nikisha mimilia alumina mwanga na kila fasi juu nipate mboga za kukula na chakula inaleta sante sana. Mbele nilikuwa naenda tafutisha mashamba mbali. Mjuma mimi navuna mara 2 au mara 3. Mafaa yenye ilishaniletea mai mwingine. Mimi naanza rudia magharibi nikirudia saa 10, mimi nakimbilia mwaka shamba. Jirani naye kama rudia usiku, kusema anda tafuta ule bundagara, anakimbilia hapa kisha tauza ule bundagara anapotea ndani. Hapa maana wale watoto wangu 6, mimi natosha hapa mboga. Mimi nikishatia kalika yabo, mimi naongezea watoto kama mtoto na pla, watoto 2 pla wanapata chakula.
WWF wakati tuexplique kutengeneza majardin, tukatengeneza tukakuwa tunapata chakula. Me tunaona ile jardin ya kwanza lokale yetu na hii kuko tofauti. Ile jardin lokale yenye tulijitengenezea ila haitoshe mboga mzuri. Me hii ni ya mzuri natosha mboga mzuri. Hazikamate vidudu. Kusudi sie wote tukue na hii, baraweza tuletea nyingine petetre yenye itadire kwa hii.
Muko mboga ya lenga-lenga, muko mboga ya mushobyo, muko mboga, muko tomati, muko matunguru, poiro, muko matunguru ya mikenge, vyote viko ndani.
Tunaweza vuna hata mara 3, hata mara 5. Na tunaweza chuma hata leo, kesho kuendelea jume naishi. Paske mboga tunazipata kila wakati. Zamani tulikuwa tunachuma mboga, tunatupa, tunaongola na inaishi.
Nous avons aussi combiné, à travers un système hybride, augmenté au biogaz les projets solaires pour permettre aux ménages, aux enfants, d'étudier, d'utiliser moins de pétrole. Et cela a un impact sur l'énergie fossile.
Nilipataka hii moto, sa VFF ituleteaka biogaz, sa limalizaka kuestare biogaz, akasema hapana, hatuweze piga mogiza, ubie tununue mabuji, njo bakatuletea pano soleil. Antuka leo tuko mwangaza mzuri sana. Franga zenye ningeuza ile petroli na makara, niko naziuzia watoto kae na uniforme na zinanisaidia kwa mganga. Na mimi nalipa kwa masomo. Wenzetu leo hii sana wako wanatuuliza sisi wenye tulipata biogazi. Eske juu ya nini nasie wale watu hawaweze tusaidia na sisi tupate tukoe sanyi. Kuko sasa mimi natia meza nje, juu niko na watoto 6 wenye wako kwa masomo. Banafanya madevari na wenzao wanakuya fanyizia madevari pale nje kwa mlango yao.
Dear colleagues and friends joining the Nature for Life Hub, my name is Kaveh Zahidi and I am the Director of FAO's Office of Climate Change, Biodiversity and Environment. It's a great pleasure to join you for this year's Hub and to share a few thoughts on agri-food solutions for delivering on biodiversity commitments. This year's topic, Opportunities to Accelerate Action on the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, or GBF, very much resonates with us at the Food and Agriculture Organization. Supporting countries to deliver on collective biodiversity commitments has to play a central role as we strive to achieve food security for all, working in more than 130 countries worldwide. Many countries are facing cascading challenges from food security to climate change and biodiversity loss. These cascading and interconnected challenges can only be addressed collectively with a comprehensive and integrated approach in the framework of sustainable food systems. By tapping into solutions that simultaneously address the challenges of biodiversity loss, climate change, land degradation and food insecurity, we see a clear opportunity to accelerate action on the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Sustainable agriculture, forestry and fisheries practices can improve adaptive capacity, enhance biodiversity, increase carbon storage on farmland and in forests, conserve and restore blue carbon and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Just to give you a couple of examples. Improved management of cropland and grazing systems could mitigate 3 to 6 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year while contributing to improving food security. Similarly, the restoration of 15% of degraded land in priority areas could sequester up to 300 gigatons of carbon dioxide over the long term and avoid up to 60% of expected extinctions. Agroforestry has the potential to increase food security for 1.3 billion people, including by increasing soil nitrogen availability to crops by over 40%, while at the same time boosting ecosystem services, promoting biodiversity conservation, reducing soil erosion rates by up to 50%, and increasing soil carbon storage. A more sustainable approach to fisheries could help restore populations of marine fish, increasing fisheries production by over 16 million tons, with an annual value of well over $30 billion. This would also increase the contribution of marine fisheries to the food security, nutrition, economies, and well-being of coastal communities. These are just a few examples of solutions on offer, solutions that have so far not been implemented at a scale that matches their potential. But the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework recognizes this potential and the crucial role of agri-food systems, with over half of its 23 targets directly linked to this sector. The framework also recognizes the clear connection that exists between biodiversity, climate change, and food security. And that's why the active participation and engagement from the agri-food sector will be key to achieving its goals and targets, fully in line with the whole of government and whole of society approach. As many of you already know, the work of FAO spans across agriculture, forestry, fisheries, and livestock. Our platforms convene decision makers to build consensus towards policies and standards that work with nature. The strategies, for example, on mainstreaming biodiversity, on climate change, and on science and innovation adopted by FAO members have helped already to strengthen and make more holistic programs and projects to support communities and countries to adopt creative, strategic, and effective agri-food solutions. Through our work, including large country support portfolios financed by the Global Environment Facilities and the Green Climate Fund, we have developed a broad range of tools to support the implementation and monitoring of the GBF and to promote alignment with national commitments on climate change and land restoration. This includes practical guides, tools, and other normative or policy instruments supporting the implementation of the ecosystem approach to fisheries and aquaculture, sustainable forest management, diversification approaches, integrated pest management and agroecology, reducing food loss and waste, to name just a few. An FAO Biodiversity Knowledge Hub will soon be launched that will help users find and access around 300 FAO tools and instruments that are relevant to one or more targets of the GBF. Throughout its entire decentralized network of offices at regional, sub-regional and country levels, and with the support of a unit dedicated to biodiversity mainstreaming, FAO is making its vast technical expertise ever more accessible to countries and partners to support their efforts to mainstream biodiversity, climate and environmental considerations across agricultural sectors. One major focus of our support and the application of the tools we have developed is, of course, the National Biodiversity Strategies and Action Plans, or NBSAPs. As countries are busy planning for and implementing these NBSAPs, let me say a few words on how we can accelerate action and step up ambition. First, it's critical to ensure engagement of agriculture sectors in planning and implementation of NBSAPs, but also of nationally determined contributions and national adaptation plans under the Paris Agreement on climate change. Second, we need to prioritize solutions that contribute to resilience, sustainable development, the halting and reversal of biodiversity loss, and mitigating and adapting to climate change, thereby helping to achieve food security and nutrition, create decent jobs, and reduce poverty. And finally, please make use of existing tools, negotiated policies, monitoring systems, and other resources. Time is short, and our focus must remain on using the platforms, tools, and mechanisms we already have in place to scale up action. All of us gathered for the Nature for Life Hub are fully aware that biodiversity is not only about conservation. It's an irreplaceable foundation that can also enhance food security, livelihoods, and well-being. We look forward to continuing our work with you, with countries and partners to ensure that agri-food systems deliver on aspirations to tackle climate change, biodiversity, and food crises collectively. Thank you very much.
El futuro de las personas, la naturaleza y la economía dependen de bosques sanos y resilientes. porque estos nos brindan servicios invaluables, pero que al mismo tiempo son infravalorados. Es momento de tomar acciones decisivas que detengan la deforestación, la degradación y la pérdida de la biodiversidad. Para lograrlo es importante disminuir la presión sobre los bosques, beneficiando a las personas y apoyando sus medios de vida. Forest Forward es un programa exclusivo de WWF para la acción corporativa en apoyo de la naturaleza, el clima y las personas. Ayuda a las empresas a aprovechar el poder de los bosques para lograr su sostenibilidad, impacto social y objetivos comerciales. 6 empresas y asociaciones peruanas se han unido a Forest Forward para mejorar la gestión de sus bosques. Al demostrar un impacto positivo en la naturaleza y las personas y colaborar con otros, esperan inspirar a otros productores agroforestales en Perú.
Aumentaremos la cobertura boscosa plantando 150 hectáreas previamente degradadas con especies arbóreas nativas.
Plantaremos 30.000 árboles de especies nativas en claros naturales, como protección de las actividades ilegales, buscando la conectividad y asegurando futuros ingresos.
Renovaremos nuestra certificación orgánica y Fairtrade, promoviendo prácticas sostenibles en las cadenas productivas de cacao y coco azul.
Promoveremos las buenas prácticas, mejoraremos los medios de vida locales y fortaleceremos la asociación para lograr la certificación orgánica.
Generaremos acciones de manejo responsable dentro de las nuevas concesiones adquiridas y promoveremos productos forestales no maderables como alternativa económica, generando más empleos y sostenibilidad.
Restauraremos 250 hectáreas de tierras degradadas y plantaremos 10.000 árboles en claros identificados, buscando aumentar el valor que nos ofrecen los bosques.
Por un mejor futuro para la naturaleza, el clima y las personas. Conoce de cerca sus iniciativas en forestforward.panda.org.
Well, hello, my name is Seth Larson, and I'm on the media team here at WWF, and I'm really lucky to be joined by 3 wonderful WWF experts here today. I'm with Jeff Opperman, our Global Freshwater Lead Scientist, Stephanie Rowe, Global Climate and Energy Lead Scientist, and Ryan Bartlett, our Director for Climate Resilience and Risk Management. Now, these 3 have all contributed to a really important report. It's titled Building a Nature-Positive Energy Transition. It was written in conjunction with the Boston Consulting Group, and it investigated the impact a rapid transition to renewable energy will have on nature. And we're here to talk about it today, and Jeff, we're going to start with you. I wanted to start by just asking why you and your colleagues decided to write this report right now. I mean, if I can just ask a dumb question, isn't it obvious that we need to transition away from fossil fuels as quickly as possible?
So I think that idea that we need to transition as fast as possible is well established, but in the past few years there's been a growing narrative that's focusing more and more on the negative impacts of that transition. Mm-hmm. And in fact, it's becoming a fairly common media theme that the headlines love to emphasize a plot twist, which is who is opposed to the energy transition? Surprise, it's the environmentalists. Yeah. And now, I think that has been overblown a bit. I think some of it is being fueled by misinformation, but there are real concerns. And like any form of development, like any energy project, an expansion of renewable energy at this scale is going to have some impacts. But we know that to achieve the scale of this energy transition at the pace that we need to achieve it at, we really have to minimize impacts, minimize conflicts to really roll it out. So that's what we wanted to tackle with this report. And so we asked 2 big questions. And the first is aimed at that narrative, that concern. And we wanted to put that concern about impacts into context, the concern about the transition, and compare it to, well, what would the world look like without the transition? So what would a business as usual world look like in terms of impacts? So really important just to put all of that in context. And then secondly, because as I mentioned, there will be impacts on communities and ecosystems, and we've got to get that right, in part just to move fast. We wanted to lay out a series of recommendations that have been made that have shown to be the most effective ways at avoiding or minimizing conflict around renewable development.
Gotcha. Okay. So, Stephanie, I want to turn to you now, and I wanted to ask, what sets this report apart? This obviously isn't the first report to look at this nexus of issues. So, what about this report stands apart and makes it different? And also, what were the key findings that you identified about this transition to renewable energy versus a business as usual future where we continue to burn fossil fuels?
Yeah, sure. So the first question really is that, previous reports have looked at the impacts for different energy sources. So for example, how much XYZ metric would have an impact from solar versus nuclear, for example. Mm-hmm. Or some reports have also quantitatively assessed how a transition to less impacts can happen on people and nature. What we do is we quantify essentially 30 different social and environmental, socioeconomic and environmental metrics, and assess them and look at two different futures. One, which is this business as usual future that continues a fossil fuel dominated energy sector, and the other is this rapid transition to renewable energy, where you have 85 to 90% renewable energy compared to business as usual, which is about 15%, right? So switching now to the second question on the key findings, what we find is that of the 30 metrics, 27 of those, the rapid transition is far better for human health, for jobs, and for nature.
Wow.
So on human health, for example, there's about 85% less disability and premature death related to air pollution. There's 160% more jobs, and there's 75% less biodiversity loss in a rapid transition future. And what's surprising, I think, in this report is that there's also significantly less mining. Even though there's going to be a large demand for critical minerals, so there's actually going to be a 2 to 15 times increase in the need and demand for critical minerals in the future, but they only make up about 5% of total metals that are mined in 2050. And also because coal mines are largely decommissioned in the rapid transition future, there's 30% less actively mined land area compared to a fossil fuel future.
Yeah, that's really surprising because we do often hear about how much mining will be necessary for these minerals to unlock a renewable energy future. But the difference between bringing those mines online versus shuttering coal mines was really striking and stood out to me as one of the more surprising things, as you just said. So you just mentioned that 27 out of the 30 metrics came down in favor of a rapid transition to a renewable energy future. Ryan, I want to turn to you now, and I wanted to ask you, so 27 out of 30, that means there were 3 things where business as usual, burning fossil fuels, actually looks better for nature. So can you talk about those 3 and tell us what they were?
Sure. So, whatever the bad analogy is, there's no free lunch, at least not entirely. We can't eat the entire, or have the entire cake and eat it too. So there's 3. One is the direct area footprint. So in other words, literally the amount of land and offshore ocean area required, whether it's for solar, wind, or bioenergy, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. Mm-hmm. Water use, so how much water is consumed under the transition, and then lastly, river fragmentation, and that's related to how much hydropower is anticipated under these different futures.
Gotcha. So I'm going to ask Jeff in a minute to talk about those last 2, but I want to stick with you for just another minute to focus on land. And I guess I was surprised to hear that. So I wanted to just ask you to unpack a little bit why pursuing a rapid transition to renewables would require more land use than business as usual.
Right. So, your average man on the street probably thinks about the land use requirements as being really significant. And what they have in their mind is big solar arrays, sure, or a lot of land required for spacing between massive turbines. That does require a lot of space in some places, but overall it's a vastly lower number than the total direct footprint for fossil energy sources. The single biggest source and why this number is so much higher under the transition is for bioenergy, biofuels, biomass, as we call it. For an American audience, the most typical example would be corn ethanol.
Right.
So, some scenarios require, the one that we looked at for this rapid transition estimates a really significant amount of biofuels in the future. And that's partly to get sustainable fuels in airplanes, for example. Another big use is what we call bioenergy carbon capture and sequestration, if I got that right. Storage. I knew it was that last S.
BECS.
BECS.
Call it.
Yeah. I'm sorry to our friends named BECS, but BECS, which involves growing crops, burning them for fuel use, and then capturing and storing that carbon underground.
Gotcha.
So in some regions like Latin America and Africa, under this rapid transition scenario, it's as high as like 40% of the energy use comes from that. Now, there are really significant ways to reduce that amount of land. In some cases, by one expert report, you can kill it entirely. You don't need any additional land for biomass, just by saving it via using waste and residues from existing crop production, increasing energy efficiency, and transitioning those sources that are, for example, power plants that rely on biomass to more renewables like wind and solar. And then there are other ways too, when we actually talk about that smaller fraction that is the land required for solar and wind. We can co-locate agriculture, what they call agrivoltaics, so growing crops between solar arrays. Similarly for wind, offshore wind, you can co-locate aquaculture production. So we'd say that's a productive use of that land, so it's not fully allocated to that energy source under the transition. But the biggest point about all of this, which is what Jeff highlighted here, which is this larger context, that climate change pulls more land off the board due to wildfires, coastal flooding, literal land loss, and aridification. In other words, it just becomes impossible to grow crops and use that land productively under a business as usual scenario than anything we looked at. It's twice as much land is lost under a BAU scenario compared to that direct energy footprint.
Wow, that's really striking. I'm from Rhode Island originally. It's the smallest state in the union. It's also, I think, per capita the most coastline of any state in the country. So in Rhode Island, we worry a lot about losing land to sea level rise and coastal storms, and it's a big concern, and same is true all across the world. So Jeff, I want to turn to you now to talk about these other two exceptions out of the 27 of the 30 metrics that were looked at. Ryan talked about land being one of the three exceptions. The other two were water use and free-flowing rivers. Now, you're an expert in these areas. So what did your research find about those two areas, and what were the main drivers of the impacts in those areas?
So let's start with water use, and it's really exactly parallel to what Ryan was just talking about. So the same way that bioenergy, biomass drives the land footprint, bioenergy and biomass drives the water use footprint. That is because in many parts of the world, crops grown for bioenergy will require irrigation. Irrigation is by far the biggest user of water in the world. So irrigation for energy crops will become by far the biggest user of energy water. And the differences aren't dramatic. The rapid transition is about 20% to 40% more water use than the business as usual. But just as Ryan was saying, if you manage the biomass question effectively, then you manage the land and you manage the water use concern effectively. And in fact, with some of these methods that Ryan talked about lowering the total footprint of biomass, every time you do that, you're also lowering the water footprint of biomass, and you can bring the rapid transition directly in line or even lower than the BAU. So meaning it's a challenge, but it's one that we clearly know how to address. The river fragmentation, so yes, the rapid transition calls for a higher level of hydropower development. And this is something that we have done a lot of research on, and we've shown that this scenario called for a certain amount of hydropower, but there are many other scenarios that anticipate a 1.5 degree future that have quite a bit lower level of hydropower. And there has been, essentially that substitution has already been underway. Wind and solar have become by far the cheapest sources of electricity on the planet. It comes in very big projects that might take a decade to build. They have a lot of complexities, even beyond the environmental and social impacts. Right. And so wind and solar can be built much quicker, and we already see this substitution underway. So if we build less hydropower, and then if we plan the hydropower very strategically that is built, we've shown that we can probably reduce about 90% of those impacts from hydropower.
90%,
yeah.
wow.
Just through better planning and through lowering that amount of hydropower. So again, it's something to very much focus on. Free-flowing rivers are already fairly rare, and so a substantial loss of free-flowing rivers is a pretty big deal for the planet. But we have some pretty clear strategies about how to avoid or minimize that impact.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, thanks for walking through those exceptions, and I don't want to spend all of our time on that, but I did just want to make sure we were sort of being upfront and working through the thought process there and what those issues were. So I think, this report really is a clarion call for how important it is to rapidly transition to a renewable energy future. It's clear that we need to do that, but it's also clear, as you all just spoke to, that we need to be thoughtful about how we do it and ensure that we're striving for nature positive outcomes, right? So how do we actually achieve those nature positive outcomes? And Jeff, I'm gonna stay with you. I think to start on this, I'd love to hear if there are some specific steps and strategies that we should be relying on to make sure that happens.
Yeah, so part one of the report, we've been largely focusing on comparing these different futures and across all these metrics. Part two really digs into a roadmap for how we can achieve a nature positive energy transition or really transformation. And we lay out 6 or 7 main mechanisms that have proven themselves to be effective at avoiding, minimizing these kinds of impacts. So for example, strategic planning of the energy mix. Countries can look at different ways of accomplishing meeting their future energy demands, compare the environmental and social performance of different options, different levels of this technology or that technology, and really start to avoid impacts at that stage by planning a mix that meets their low carbon goals, but also is as sustainable as possible. That points to low impact siting. So there's a lot of opportunities to site new projects in areas that have low conflicts or low impacts. In fact, some recent research has showed that most countries can accomplish their energy, renewable energy goals by siting in very low conflict land. So for solar panels, that would be on rooftops, that would be in abandoned coal mines, floating on reservoirs. For wind, that would be within agricultural areas or in pastures. There's just a lot of places that we can put new renewable projects with very minimal conflict with people or nature. And then I think we've already been talking about how to lower the footprint of things like biomass or things like hydropower, a lot of strategies to do that.
Yeah, so Ryan, same question to you. What are some strategies that we should be looking at here?
Yeah, I mean, maybe the single most important factor here, and is one of the biggest changes that we've already started to see in the infrastructure planning space. But if we remotely want to achieve a nature positive transition here, we have to have communities and stakeholders at the center of the planning process, and as early and as often as possible. So your Rhode Island case, for example, working early with those coastal landowners to really talk about the benefits of offshore wind compared to that larger context of how much sea level rise is going to take away that coastline if they're not investing in these kinds of approaches. So yeah, really we need to center and involve local communities that are most impacted by both localized infrastructure development, so that NIMBYs turn to YIMBYs, that they're in favor of it, and fully understand that that larger context of climate change is so much worse for them in those local impacts. So that's a critical piece of it. We just can't have nature positive. We cannot reverse these declines in biodiversity loss without really centering people in the approach moving forward.
Yeah. So I think we're kind of butting up against our time limit a little bit here. So I'm gonna give our last question over to Stephanie. And I wanted to just reflect on the word transformation. It's in the headline, the title of the report. It's used in a lot of different ways, in a lot of different contexts nowadays. I wanted to ask you what it means to you in the context of this report, and what will it look like to have transformed the energy sector down the road?
Yeah, this is a really critical question because, so in the report, we refer to transformation as essentially the global systemic change in the energy sector that combines all of the needed transitions at a local, regional, and national level. So the transitions include, for example, transitioning from fossil fuels to renewable energy, broad-scale electrification, also massive uptake of energy efficiency improvements, and it combines all of those transitions at a global level. But what's also really critical is how we do that transformation or those transitions, how we integrate these approaches that Jeff and Ryan just said, and making sure that these approaches that we're proposing become actually standard practice in how we make these transitions happen. And ultimately, really what it means to have truly transformed or made this transformation is that nature and people are at the heart of decision making.
Right.
And so that's the only way that we're able to truly achieve a sustainable development and nature positive future.
Great. Well, thank you for taking the time to talk about this really important report. It was a pleasure I got to read the executive summary yesterday as a prep to study for this conversation. It's a fascinating read, it's an easy read, it's a really important read. Thank you for the work you all did in putting it together, and thank you for being here today.
Great.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you, Seth.
Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Manoswini Sarkar, the Global Energy Policy Officer at BirdLife International, and today we will be discussing on ways to ensure a nature-positive renewable energy transition. The interconnected planetary crisis of climate change and biodiversity loss are interlinked. Climate change is one of the main drivers of biodiversity loss and is leading to irreversible changes to it. However, biodiversity loss also further jeopardizes the functioning of ecosystems and their ability to withstand environmental changes, especially climate change. The primary cause of increasing global temperatures is greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuel use. Global greenhouse gas emissions continue to grow rapidly despite pledges by governments, including as parties to the UNFCCC Paris Agreement, which aims to reach global peaking of greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible to stay within the 1.5 degree rise in temperature. Therefore, there is an urgent need for a rapid phase-out of fossil fuels and a global transition to net zero greenhouse gas emissions. In 2022, parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity agreed to the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which has a mission to halt and reverse the loss of biodiversity by 2030, otherwise known as being nature positive. To achieve this mission, the Global Biodiversity Framework must take a whole-of-society approach, and renewable energy has potential to contribute to the overall goal of nature positive. However, if not planned, designed, sited, or managed properly, renewable energy infrastructure can have significant adverse environmental impacts. Let's take a look at what the United Nations Convention on Migratory Species of Wildlife has been doing to ensure a nature-positive renewable energy transition.
The global energy demand is expected to rise 30% by 2040. Meeting this target while fighting climate change means an increase in renewable energy. However, transitioning to renewable sources of energy, such as wind and solar, could negatively impact migratory species and their habitat. As an example, more than 300,000 birds could be killed annually in Canada and the US by ill-planned wind turbines. Migratory species are an integral part of nature and provide important functions such as pest control, pollination, and seed dispersal, and generate millions of dollars and jobs from a variety of sectors. Over 11 million hectares of natural land and more than 1,500 threatened species could be impacted by renewable energy infrastructure development. CMS, the Convention on the Conservation of Migratory Species of Wild Animals, is an environmental treaty of the United Nations that established the Energy Task Force in 2015 to reconcile renewable energy and wildlife conservation. The CMS Energy Task Force is a platform where governments, multilateral environmental agreements, investors, researchers, and NGOs come together to share information, establish best practices, and promote innovative and responsible solutions. It is possible to achieve the goals of the Paris Climate Change Agreement while protecting migratory species and their vital ecosystem services. Together, clean energy and thriving migratory species mean a healthier future for people and nature. Learn more about the CMS Energy Task Force and how to join it by visiting our website.
BirdLife International coordinates the Energy Task Force, and as mentioned, the task force develops tools, guidance, and best practice guidelines to ensure a just, nature-sensitive, and nature-positive renewable energy transition. One of such tools is the Avian Sensitivity Tool for Energy Planning, otherwise known as AVSTEP. Now, let's hear from my colleague Tris Allenson explaining how we developed AVSTEP, which can be utilized to ensure renewable energy technologies have the least impact on avian species and to support the spatial planning requirement of Target 1 of the Global Biodiversity Framework.
Good morning. My name is Tris Allenson. I am a Senior Conservation Scientist at BirdLife International. I lead our work on bird conservation and energy. Today, I will talk about the importance of sensitivity mapping in reconciling bird conservation with the deployment of energy infrastructure. Whilst electrification and renewable energy expansion are essential, they can pose a significant environmental risk if not planned in a nature-safe manner. Already, there are over 65 million kilometres of power line globally, enough to stretch the moon and back 169 times. And it is calculated that this amount will need to more than double in order to accommodate the transition to renewables. Poorly sited, badly designed, and insufficiently mitigated energy infrastructure can significantly impact biodiversity, especially birds. Some species are highly susceptible to collision with power lines. In this video, we see mute swans colliding with a line in Slovakia. Note, the collisions are occurring on the section of line that has not been fitted with bird flight diverters. Even when not fatal, power lines can disorientate and confuse flying birds, as seen in this footage of a common crane flock encountering a transmission line in India. Birds can also be vulnerable to electrocution on poorly designed and insulated lines. Ensuring that power line infrastructure is constructed in a nature-safe manner requires that its development adheres to the mitigation hierarchy. The mitigation hierarchy is a stepwise framework, starting with the most important consideration and then continuing through increasingly less desirable alternatives. Importantly, subsequent stages of the hierarchy should only be applied if an earlier stage has been fully considered but is deemed to be not possible or not likely to be sufficient in ameliorating the negative impacts of the development. The first, and by far the most effective stage of the mitigation hierarchy, is avoidance. Routing power lines away from high-risk areas such must be the first consideration. When placement in a high-risk area is unavoidable, then line burial should be considered. If avoidance is not possible, then risk should be minimized through mitigation measures. Restoration should be considered when damage was unavoidable, but can be rectified. Offsetting is the last option to be considered, and only when all previous measures have proven ineffective. Although avoidance is by far the most important component of the mitigation hierarchy, it is too often omitted or applied poorly. Too often, biodiversity is only considered once a development site has already been identified. A site-level assessment can only ever tell you if a site has sensitive wildlife. It cannot tell you how sensitive that site is relative to the wider landscape, and indeed whether there are more suitable locations elsewhere. To meet this requirement, the requirements of the mitigation hierarchy, there is a need to consider biodiversity further upstream in the development process, when a whole country or region can be strategically assessed and development optimised from both an environmental and technical standpoint. One of the key ways to integrate biodiversity data into strategic landscape scale planning is to utilise sensitivity mapping. In sensitivity mapping, distributional data on sensitive species and ecological features are used to produce maps indicating the potential sensitivity of an area to a certain form of infrastructure. Some of the first sensitivity maps were developed by BirdLife's partner in the UK, the RSPB. These depicted avian sensitivity in relation to wind energy development. The first such map was developed for Scotland. The darker areas on the map were those assessed to be most sensitive to wind energy development. The lighter areas are those thought to be least sensitive. If we look at where wind farms were subsequently developed in Scotland, all the blue and green shapes are constructed wind farms of various sizes, we can see that those areas assessed by the RSPB as likely to be least sensitive, and therefore most suitable, are to a large extent the areas where development has occurred. Scotland therefore constitutes a good example of how to plan a renewable energy sector in a responsible and nature-safe manner. Most recently, BirdLife International, with support from the Asian Development Bank, has developed an online sensitivity mapping platform called AviStep, Avi for bird and STEP for sensitivity tool for energy planning, and also an allusion to the fact that the use of such tools should be seen as an essential first step in nature-safe energy planning. AviStep launched in 2022, initially covering 4 countries in Asia. Work is now underway to expand it globally. AviStep is designed to be intuitive to use, requiring no specialist knowledge. However, it is recommended that first-time users watch the short tutorial video before exploring the tool. The homepage also contains a manual documenting the methodology underpinning AviStep in detail. Once a country is selected, a user can then choose the energy type for which they would like to understand the avian sensitivity. These are onshore wind energy, offshore wind energy, solar photovoltaic, and overhead power lines, both low and medium voltage distribution lines and high voltage transmission lines. Selecting transmission lines reveals the avian sensitivity to this infrastructure type across the selected country. There are 4 categories of sensitivity: low, moderate, high, and very high. Users can see what size and percentage of area falls within each of these categories. Users can also review the avian sensitivity at the state or province level, for example, in Rajasthan. Users can focus in on specific locations and receive a detailed assessment of avian sensitivity. As a user moves into the map, a 5 km by 5 km grid is revealed. At this point, a user can click on a grid cell to get the sensitivity assessment for that cell. For instance, this grid cell receives a sensitivity score of 100%. This means that the avian sensitivity is assessed as very high. Development here is considered to pose a very high risk to bird populations. However, comprehensive site-level assessment is necessary to confirm this level of risk. This grid cell, for instance, falls within the Desert National Park and is considered an important bird area. There are also 25 species considered sensitive to collision with transmission lines that could occur at this site. They are listed starting with the most sensitive, in this case Great Indian Bustard, a species highly impacted by power lines. They then move on to less sensitive species. The occurrence certainty indicates how certain it is that the species occurs within that grid cell. By clicking on occurrence certainty, the species are ordered beginning with those there is very high certainty of their occurrence. Those assessed as very high, for more than 50% of the cell is covered by their preferred habitat, and their presence has been confirmed by on-the-ground surveys. If we switch to the map for distribution lines, we can see that this assessment takes account of both collision and electrocution. For example, at this site, 43 species are identified as being affected by collision and/or electrocution. The most electrocution-prone species being vultures, eagles, and falcons, due to their habit for perching on powerline poles and the fact that their large size makes simultaneous contact with two live elements more likely. Avistep provides planners and developers with an early understanding of the biodiversity situation so that they can be better prepared and can avoid high-risk areas or factor suitable mitigation into their project design from the outset. BirdLife is committed to expanding Avistep to new regions and countries around the world in collaboration with the energy sector. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for joining us today. Please see the following websites and link for more information on this topic, or contact the CMS Energy Task Force Coordinator, my colleague Dr. Rhiannon Niven at BirdLife International.
Before we continue with the program, let's take a moment to pause and reflect. Join me in listening to the words of Sir Ben Okri, reading from Tiger Work, Stories, Poems, and Essays about Climate Change. Enjoy!
I'm going to read to you from my new book called Tiger Work, and it is dedicated to all those who love the world enough to fight for it. There is a time for hope, and there is a time for realism. But what is needed now is beyond hope and realism. This is a time when we ought to dedicate ourselves to bringing about the greatest shift in human consciousness and in the way we live. We ought to consecrate ourselves to bringing about a conscious evolutionary leap forward. No longer can we be the human beings we have been, wasteful, thoughtless, selfish, destructive. It is now time for us to be the most creative we've ever been, the most far-sighted, the most practical, the most conscious and selfless. The stakes have never been and will never be higher. What is called for here is a special kind of love for the world. The love of those who discover the sublime value of life because they're about to lose it. For we are on the verge of losing this most precious and beautiful of worlds, a miracle in all the universe, a home for the evolution of souls, a little paradise here in the richness of space where we're meant to live and grow and be happy, but which we are day by day turning into a barren stone in space. This is the best and most natural home we're ever going to have. And we need to become a new people to deserve it. We're going to have to be new artists to redream it. We can only make a future from the depth of the truth that we face now. The facts are horrific, the evidence overwhelming, and still we carry on as if no crisis were looming. What can one say to those who either don't want to hear or have heard enough? And what can one say that does not paralyze some with the sheer scale of the problem? Can't you hear the future weeping? Our love must save the world. Facts don't alter our dreams or change our minds. So I thought maybe love could shift our vision, shift our breath, shift our dreams. Maybe if we all do something modest, then the dead land can yield roses again. Perhaps we've grown too complicated for our own good. I think that love is the highest economy of life. In the Tao Te Ching, there is a light-crammed passage which says that the sage loves the world as they love their body. If the earth were our body, would we do half the things to it that we're doing? Nothing can save our world but love. For love is the last power that stands between us and extinction. For when we act with love, we act with all the greatest powers of the human spirit. What we need now, in this 11th hour, when the bell tolls in the sinister tower, is the greatness of the human. But the love I'm talking about is not passive. Let's turn the fierce force of our love to saving life on this planet. Can't you hear the future weeping? Our love must save the world.
It's clear that the private sector needs to evolve into a catalyst for a nature-positive economy. In the next segment, Unlocking Private Sector Finance, we'll take a look at the role of private sector finance and examine a range of approaches, from banking to investments, from small business finance to finance policies. These cases will show that the transformation of the private sector finance is not only possible, it's already happening. Let's get started.
Our planet currently faces a triple threat: biodiversity loss, climate change, and pollution. And each of those need to be addressed urgently. Now, there are different ways and strategies to address them, and one of these strategies are nature-based solutions. The European Union defines nature-based solutions as solutions that are inspired and supported by nature, which are cost-effective, simultaneously provide environmental, social, and economic benefits, and help build resilience. The definition further goes on: such solutions bring more and more diverse nature and natural features and processes to cities, landscapes, and seascapes through locally adapted, resource-efficient, and systemic interventions. So nature-based solutions have a really big potential. But what do they look like in practice? One very concrete example would be if you have a mountain where you have the threat of landslides. What you could do is, instead of putting in a fence made of metal, you could plant trees and shrubs along that mountain, which also help prevent landslides. The projects Network Nature Plus support these nature-based solutions by being a resource for the nature-based solutions community. We also strive to create opportunities for local, regional, and international cooperation to maximize the impact and spread of nature-based solutions. And the projects are funded by the European Commission. And this kind of work we're doing in these projects includes supporting the work done by other projects on NBS funded by the EU and spreading their results further. And what we currently see is really encouraging because it's a policy push towards more funding for nature-based solutions. So, for example, we have the EU Biodiversity Strategy for 2030, and that includes a call to all cities above 20,000 inhabitants to develop urban greening. The Davos World Economic Forum published a report, New Nature Economy Report, The Future of Nature and Business, and they actually make a clear business case for investing in nature-based solutions with a potential return on investment estimated at $10 trillion and almost 400 million jobs by 2030. The United Nations State of Finance for Nature report calls for investments into nature-based solutions and to triple those investments by 2030 and to increase them fourfold by 2050 from what we currently see as investment. And some of these policies are a more general call to action, and others have binding targets attached to them. An example would be the European Union Nature Restoration Law, which is part of the EU Biodiversity Strategy for 2030. And if you look at how to put these plans into practice to reach these targets, many of them will include implementing new nature-based solutions, which is great. And then, of course, you need someone to invent and deliver all those nature-based solutions. And here, enterprises play a vital part. And so we wanted to support these enterprises in the field and talk to enterprises themselves, to business support organizations, and to experts on what they would need to further their work into nature-based solutions. And what was really interesting, that a main point was that these enterprises are at very different stages regarding their journey and level of previous knowledge about nature-based solutions. So there are already enterprises in the field, and some of them even for decades, and some of them are what you could call nature-based enterprises even. So they're enterprises which contribute to the development and delivery of nature-based solutions and for whom nature is at the core of their business. Then there are other enterprises who are just starting their journey. And so the challenge was to put together existing information in a way so it could be helpful to all these enterprises and really easily accessible. And the result is the Nature-Based Solutions Business Information Package. So what it does is it takes existing information, as mentioned earlier, looking at projects that have worked on NBS, especially in the European realm, and packaging that information in a good way for enterprises. So what it includes is it includes information on nature-based solutions and nature-based enterprises, and including success stories of enterprises, because that's always inspiring to see what others have achieved, and also including the challenges they have faced. We provide further details regarding nature-based solutions as a business opportunity, and also for those enterprises who have been in the field for long and who want to grow their business, more in-depth information, especially about business models. And there are business models which were specifically developed for nature-based solutions, including graphics of business model canvases to work with that. And we wrap the document up by providing practical guidance. So if you really want to start your NBS journey or grow your NBS journey, where can you find information on policy and legislation, where you can find networks with like-minded enterprises, and where can you find funding? So that concludes the document, and we really wanted to finish by something very practical that people could use hands-on. And the entire document is set out so you can skip directly to the part that you're interested in. You don't have to read it from beginning to end. We've kept the information really brief and to the point because this is supposed to be sort of a signpost for interested enterprises. And then you have lots of hyperlinks in the document. So at any points that you're interested in more further information, you can get to that further information and additional materials very easily. And so hopefully that will help enterprises in entering the market or the field of nature-based solutions and in growing the field of nature-based solutions, and to see what great business opportunities are out there, and to use the resources that are out there also in a good way. And we really hope to make a contribution there to invite enterprises to become part of that transition and to help us address the triple threat of biodiversity loss, climate change, and pollution, but also by implementing and inventing new nature-based solutions.
Hi there, I'm Chris Moore, Associate at Terranomics. Terranomics is a consultancy committed to using local and global financial systems to support nature-based solutions. We're currently spread across the United Kingdom, Southeast Asia, and the USA. We recently undertook a study on behalf of FMO, the Development Bank of the Netherlands, to understand how we can increase the flow of private commercial capital to forestry and sustainable land use. The end goal was to produce concrete recommendations for funds and companies operating forestry and sustainable land use. These are the people seeking that commercial capital. This was based on the experiences of the Mobilising Finance for Forests, or MFF programme. MFF is a blended finance investment programme financed by the UK government and managed by FMO on their behalf, that seeks to combat deforestation and other environmentally unsustainable land practices. What's the context of the study, the challenge? We hear various finance gaps discussed, but already just meeting climate targets in this sector requires a significant 26-fold increase from today's levels. These figures aren't impossible. However, today, most of that financing and the financing channel into forestry and sustainable land use comes from public or perhaps less commercially focused actors that lack large pools of capital. MFF's own experience is that even funds or companies with great track records and well-established teams find attracting this commercial investment difficult. We wanted to understand directly from commercial investors what those barriers are and which of those could be addressed in the short versus long term, and by funds and companies within their circle of influence. In many ways, many of these barriers are well documented. We undertook a previous study with WWF to look at these. In many ways, this study was a follow-on from that. If you're interested in learning more on that, you can search this title here on the slide or get in touch with us for the link. Why is this study important? You've heard how we wanted to find out what the main barriers are that commercial investors face that stops them investing in forestry and sustainable land use, and what can funds and companies do to overcome these barriers. To do this, we spoke to 40 organisations, which included commercial banks, insurers, pension funds, these are your commercial investors, but also development banks, more impact-focused investors, and funds and companies. We feel this gives the study really deep insights into commercial investor views. We believe the study results also demonstrate the opportunities for funds and companies to attract commercial investment more broadly. And finally, it's more than just a discussion paper. We provide actionable and realistic recommendations for funds and companies to put into practice straight away and over the short to medium term. So who are these recommendations targeted at? Following the study publication, FMO is sharing them with funds and companies in the MFF portfolio, but they're really intended for any fund or company in forestry and sustainable land use. We want the recommendations to assist as many as possible, so get in touch if you want to help share them. And to those of you watching who are experienced in this area of investment, you might think these recommendations seem like things we should already be doing. What is interesting about the study results is that it highlighted what many commercial investors feel, even experienced funds and companies, may overlook some of those key barriers. So what are those barriers? Rather than show you a sea of barriers, as there were 21 in total, what you can see here are the broad categories of barriers that we were hearing from commercial investors. You can see they cover a range, and for reference, we can show you the top 5 barriers for commercial investors, basically which barriers came up again and again in interviews. These were things like low risk-adjusted returns, lack of track record and financial and technical competency gaps within funds and companies, tenor mismatch, in other words, high capital expenditure but long dated return profiles, and liquidity challenges, so investors getting their returns when they want them. That brings us to the recommendations themselves. First, we start with 3 recommendations for companies, then 3 for funds, and we finish with 4 recommendations that apply to both. Now, if you want to read the full recommendations list, it's all in the main report, but I just want to highlight some of the more interesting findings relating to those recommendations. So companies should secure local government, NGO, and community support and offer support for due diligence processes to investors, but they should also provide detailed business plans, financial models, for example. For example, we heard how very few commercial investors were seeing the standard or detail of financial model that they would expect. For funds, the fund vehicle should be tailored to the limited partners and geographies of the targeted investor. This sounds intuitive, but often we see it done the other way around. Funds should also align where possible with the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, the SFDR. This is an EU regulation which will make attracting European investors far easier. So even if you're not based in Europe, and a lot of these projects are in Latin America, Southeast Asia, Africa, it will make attracting those European investors much easier. Finally, funds should build NGO pipeline partnerships, linking a fund origination process with an entity like WWF, TNC, etc. And then the recommendations that apply to both groups. Funds and companies can build up their complementary skill sets and experience, and they can diversify their income streams. That will enhance their risk-adjusted returns, which might mean a more diverse range of crops or revenue from carbon credits, for instance. And the third recommendation there is linked closely to that, where we recommend targeting financial and carbon-linked returns, which can better appeal to a broader base of investors. And because investors are increasingly interested in carbon as a source of revenue. And finally, liquidity options. This is admittedly a hard nut to crack, but offering investor-friendly liquidity options will go a long way to giving investors the reassurance they need to invest. So that was a pretty rapid overview of our findings, but we encourage you to check out the full report, where you can also see case studies, the full list of barriers and recommendations, and additional guidance and examples. If there are 3 key messages we want you to take from this presentation, though, it's this. First, in forestry and sustainable land use, often you'll see great projects or funds that struggle to access commercial capital, even though they will have great environmental and social impact. This is ultimately because they haven't overcome the barriers that we mentioned earlier. Commercial investors are most interested in clear returns in reasonable timeframes, and they want confidence in strong management teams. Second, it's important to stress that most of these recommendations should not require significant change or shifts in fund or company strategy. They're attainable. And finally, as we mentioned, it might be possible that some experienced funds or companies are already overlooking these recommendations. But the reality is they could make the difference in accessing those capital providers. So thank you for watching. We hope you found this talk useful or interesting. And again, we want this study to be as useful to the market as possible. If you feel you can make use of the study or even help us share it, please do get in touch. You have a couple of emails there you can contact, or if you're interested in the full report, you can find it online or get in touch with us directly. Thank you.
Hello, I'm David Donnelly from the Nature-Based Solutions Accelerator at WWF UK. The Nature-Based Solutions Accelerator is part of the Climate Solutions Partnership between HSBC, the World Resources Institute and WWF UK. The aim of our partnership is to mobilise finance and drive change across the finance sector to accelerate the transition to net zero, restore nature and build a better and more sustainable future. Now, this talk is about finding ways to unblock finance for nature, about closing the gap between financial sector ambition and nature-based solutions project realities. Why is this important? Well, when financial institutions begin seriously to look at how to finance nature commercially, i.e. not just with philanthropy, they quickly realise how complex it is relative to the types of investment they're familiar with. For example, let's compare investing in nature to investing in large-scale infrastructure like utility wind farms or solar parks. The conditions which make these renewable energy projects financeable include things like having a pre-licensed and specific site for the project's exclusive use, a known technology, performance and revenues backstopped by large corporates or government agencies. Now, compare that to investing in nature-based solutions. Firstly, what is the site? What are its boundaries? And bear in mind that to get to similar financing transaction sizes to large renewables, it might have to be very big, in the hundreds of square kilometres. Who owns this land? And more importantly, who lives there and what lives there? And how can you structure the investment in ways that are fair to local communities, ensures their buy-in, and incentivises them to provide their essential know-how to ensure the long-term upkeep of the project? For the nature and climate benefits that you're seeking, how will you fund and design the interventions to ensure the long-term positive impacts? And all of this is before you begin to think about how revenues can be generated. So for financiers, there's a big learning curve and a lot of obstacles to tackle. I'm sure some of the other Nature for Life talks this week will be talking about those. Instead, I'd like to explore one topic, which is the oft-stated need to intervene at landscape or regional level to restore nature, and the corresponding wish of financiers to invest at this large scale. The problem is that landscape level investment opportunities in nature-based solutions are limited. This is due to the absence to date in most places of the policy mechanisms that facilitate landscape level interventions and their financing at capital market scale. And even where those mechanisms or frameworks exist or are being developed, I would argue that these top-down approaches will fail unless they allow for a bottom-up response through which robust project-level mechanisms and credit-worthy intermediaries can percolate funding down to the ground-level nature-based solutions. Now, to consider this, we need first to identify what are the potential commercial revenues for nature-based solutions which can allow private commercial finance to get repaid. Now, these revenue streams for nature-based solutions can be categorized between yield enhancing, where there's an increase in the value of local products and services as a result of implementing the nature-based solution. These can include commodities such as agricultural produce and aquaculture, sustainable timber, fisheries and ecotourism. Then there's loss avoidance, where nature-based solutions prevent future local economic, social or environmental loss. These can include flood defences, clean water supply, resource protection, health benefits and biodiversity restoration. But they typically require jurisdiction-specific legislated or contracted mechanisms to establish the payments for these benefits, and these are sometimes called Payments for Ecosystem Services, or PES. Finally, there are also the various mandated biodiversity credit schemes that are beginning to emerge. And last but not least, there are climate benefits, where nature-based solutions verifiably reduce atmospheric CO2 concentrations through carbon sequestration, enabling the sale of carbon credits. UNEP data shows that to date, most private commercial investment in nature has been based either on carbon credits or on sustainable commodity revenues, which attracts supply chain investors. There have been very few payment for ecosystem service mechanisms to date, which suggests that for a substantial scale-up in private investment to occur, policymakers must move to establish these robust PES mechanisms or else mandated biodiversity credit markets. These would then enable financeable revenue instruments to be created. However, although necessary, these financeable revenue streams are not sufficient for enabling nature-based solutions to access finance. Achieving scale is essential as well to meet the minimum transaction sizes of investors. Now, this can be achieved through aggregation of local projects to levels which, although they can be sub-landscape, where intermediate financial entities such as locally based banks, project developers, supply chain corporate investors, and nature-based impact funds, as shown on the screen, can efficiently evaluate the financing proposition offered by nature-based solutions. In time, and with policy support, aggregation or scale-up by projects can attain landscape scale and then enable direct access for landscape-level funds to access the wholesale capital markets, such as through bond finance, institutional equity, and development bank facilities. Alternatively, or alongside this, the intermediate financial entities, they can grow their portfolios of smaller scale nature-based solutions and investments to the point where they can obtain portfolio level financing for those loans and investments from the wholesale financial markets, for example, through issuing green bonds to investors or through green loan facilities from development banks. In the Nature-Based Solutions Accelerator under the Climate Solutions Partnership, we're supporting this process of scaling up nature-based solutions. We're helping some high-quality projects across the world on their journey towards investment readiness. Using these exemplary projects, we aim to show how local projects can be financed and how they can be scaled or replicated to enable investment in nature-based solutions at landscape level in ways that are safe and fair for people, safe for nature, and safe for investors. Finally, I'd add that there are other organisations who are also looking at this problem, and I'm very hopeful that together this upward push can help give policymakers an understanding of what's needed to enable nature-based solutions finance markets to grow and to build knowledge within financial institutions so that they can begin to confidently invest in nature at large scale. Thank you for listening today, and please do reach out if you have any comments or queries.
Hi, my name is Salman Hussein. I work for the United Nations Environment Programme. I'm based in Geneva, and I also head up the Economics of Nature Unit and Ecosystems Division, but for the purposes of this presentation, more focus on the initiative called the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity, which I'm the global coordinator for. Thank you for the opportunity for presenting at the Nature for Life Hub. I want to give an idea of how our work has shown that the application of economic valuation can make a real difference in terms of policy mainstreaming and pro-nature policy options being presented and accepted. Starting with the background and context, what we're trying to do in terms of food systems transformation, following very much from what the UN Food Systems Summit is calling for, is fixing food metrics. We've typically focused very much in the past, or indeed today, on yield per hectare. But what we propose in terms of our work in TEEB and UNEP is that we should look more widely. We should look at the impacts on nature, on biodiversity and climate, which are typically not included within market prices, and have a wider series of integrated metrics to make our decisions. We in TEEB have developed a TEEB Agri-food framework for analysis. This is an inclusive and comprehensive framework. Ever since the inception of the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity in 2008, we've very much focused on the typically invisible ecosystem services that are provided for free, so to speak, by nature. In the case of agriculture and food systems, it's particularly pertinent because agriculture and food systems depend so heavily on things like pollination services, prevention of soil erosion, maintaining local atmospheric quality. But typically they're not marketed in the marketed overall. We also in the framework look at things like health impacts as well, as you see from the top right. We're trying to basically recognize, capture and value the nature's contribution to people. And that's what we show in terms of policy making. The previous slide was the bit of the framework which was looking within farm gate. Our framework is much wider than that. It's looking at the entire value chain, all the way from farm gate to final disposal. So the European Union called this farm to fork, and that's an apt way of describing this. We're also looking at a range of what we call capital stocks. So not just the produced capital, which typically we focused on, but natural, social, and human capital as well. The natural capital gives us the ecosystem services, which I've alluded to already. The human capital is the ingenuity, which allows us to actually prosper, including indigenous knowledge. And social capital are the networks that bind us together and actually help us increase productivity within the economy. Our value proposition in TEEB is fairly straightforward. It's simply saying in terms of today versus the future, if we look at all those externalities and impacts, we would probably make very different decisions to the ones we're making today, where today we focus only on financial and what is marketed. We have studies globally, and the example I'm going to give you is the one from Thailand, but we have many studies going on globally. Now, the Thai study, we're looking to integrate the value of ecosystems and biodiversity in rice systems, looking at organic versus conventional production. We start in TEEB and in UNEP with scenario development. We start by asking policymakers what are viable policy interventions that you're considering that economic analysis might actually help you make a decision on. So there's an extant current policy which is called the 1 million rye organic rice farming project. But what we look to try and do, speaking to parliamentarians, what would be an ambitious alternative to that? And what we have here in this slide, we basically have the initial modelling results, which look at areas which are bioclimatically suitable to extend this policy and upscale it in a very significant way. Scenario 4 is most radical, which is transformational change towards sustainability. And you see the area in red being organic. Now that is where bioclimatically it might make sense to have organic, but is it economically and socially and ecologically sensible? That's what we're looking at. The first thing that typically comes up when we have a discussion about organic versus conventional is what happens to yields? Can we afford this? Can we afford this with respect to food security? Now, our analysis showed that we actually can do so. If we actually pick areas that are bioclimatically suitable for organic, the yield losses are very low in nature. Secondly, greenhouse gas emissions. Overall greenhouse gas emissions reduce, and that's primarily because we no longer have the burning of rice husk, which creates PM 2.5, particulate matters, and creates all kinds of other environmental problem, health-related problems. We do have trade-offs, though, in terms of there are higher greenhouse gas emissions from cultivation for organic, but those are compensated for in the round. There is enhanced biodiversity, which you'd expect, which is what TEEB is about, but that's actually being measured in terms of on-farm biodiversity, particularly in terms of insect biodiversity for organic versus conventional production. The big one is health impacts. Now, if we take into account, as I mentioned, PM 2.5, then many of you will have seen pictures of the smog in various cities of the world which arises from straw burning. You'll see that that's a massive impact. We've tried to look at measures including quality adjusted life years and what the health implications are of that PM 2.5 and the benefits of avoiding it. And we find some very massive figures in that regard, which are credible, reasonable. Overall, you see the summary here. Dark red is the health impact, but overall, all of these are benefits which arise to the Thai people shipping to organic production. What can we discover? There's only a 1% difference on production projected yields for organic versus conventional rice. We'll see that only with a subset of those things which we can measure and value, organic is better. We haven't put a price on or valued biodiversity gains, we haven't valued nutritional benefits, we haven't valued the increased involvement of women. And these are benefits that arise and distribute to the Thai citizens. We of course produced a report on this, and are mainstreaming the results now in Thailand before the end of this year, 2023. My penultimate slide before finishing is, I think, a lovely quote from the Kunming Montreal event at which the Global Biodiversity Framework was agreed. And this is actually a quote from the Chinese minister, who was the one who actually put the gavel down for the agreement. He said, China is willing to join hands with all parties actively to apply TEEB approaches and carry out TEEB national actions, and to work together to reverse the global trend of biodiversity loss and build a community of life on Earth and a beautiful home where people and nature live in harmony. I couldn't have expressed it better myself. My thanks to him, my thanks to you for listening. I think valuation has a real role to play if applied properly. Please do get back in touch if you have any further questions. Bye-bye for now.
What if planet Earth had an investment portfolio? Now, more than ever, we know that she would choose sustainable, nature-based solutions as guiding principles for her investments. Eco Enterprises Fund knows this well. For 25 years, we have built a track record of pioneering investments in companies that are doing well by doing good. Eco Enterprises Fund was first on the ground to invest in sustainable, biodiverse businesses with investments that have increased 20-fold over 3 funds. The results? Our investment in nearly 50 companies has generated $2.5 billion in sales, supporting over 85,000 suppliers. Together, we have protected 15 million acres of rainforest, critical ecosystems, watersheds, and working landscapes, benefiting 400,000 local people in 1,400 different communities in 12 countries. The results are businesses that lead the way to better safeguard natural assets and that understand addressing climate change through approaches like regenerative agriculture and forestry works. Businesses like Equilibria, converting degraded cattle pastures in Colombia into organic citrus farms, creating meaningful social and environmental benefits. Or Banana, one of the first companies to reduce food waste through upcycle surplus bananas and plantains into healthy snack foods. And, through Agropollo in Ecuador, formed the largest network of organic plantain smallholder farms. Now more than ever, Eco Enterprises Fund is determined to pave the way for those that want to join us in doing well by doing good. As we move into our fourth fund, our women-led team continues to catalyze innovative, nature-based actions that are attractive for investors and the planet. We're scaling investment and impact outcomes in next-generation entrepreneurs, leading the way to achieve biodiversity conservation, climate solutions, and social equity. Our guiding principles focus on planetary health and a just transition to a sustainable world. Eco Enterprises Fund builds portfolios for the planet to continue our legacy to transform. Eco Enterprises Fund will continue to invest with purpose. The Earth and future generations would expect nothing less.
Hello, everyone. Today is a day to remember, as this morning in Montreal, 196 nations have agreed a global biodiversity framework. I am Simone Detling, Head of Banking at UNEP-FI, and I have with me my colleague Jessica Smith, Head of Nature, who was at the negotiations in Montreal. And we welcome you to a discussion today to talk about this historic agreement and, importantly, its implications for the financial industry. Welcome, Jessica.
Thank you, Simone. So glad to be here.
Jessica, the UN Secretary General has heralded this agreement as humanity's peace treaty with nature. But what exactly is in this global biodiversity framework? And why is it such a historic agreement on par with the Paris Climate Agreement a few years ago?
Thank you. Well, I certainly concur that this is an incredible moment for nature. The headline goal coming out of the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework is that we will collectively work towards halting and reversing nature loss by 2030. So that's the 1.5 degree equivalent. And this includes restoring 30% of land and water, freshwater and oceans by 2030 as well. We will be working towards living in harmony with nature by 2050 and sharing the benefits from nature fairly, including with Indigenous peoples and local communities who are frontline stewards of nature. We also have the headline goal to ensure that there are adequate resources for implementation of this framework, including the alignment of all financial flows, public and private. So that is the Paris 2.1C equivalent.
Okay, Jessica, our executive director, Inga Anderson, and hearing this, I think she's quite right. She has framed this as our chance to shore up and strengthen the web of life so it can carry the full weight of generations to come. And when I listen to you, it sounds like there is a very strong, a key role to be played by the financial industry, especially also by the global banking sector. And at UNEP-FI, of course, we host the world's foremost sustainable banking framework, the Principles for Responsible Banking, with more than 300 signatories worldwide, representing about half of the world's assets. So to these members, what do you say? What can they do to play their role in achieving these goals? And what are the implications for them going forward?
Absolutely. There's so many, and some are calling for voluntary action and some are regulatory requirements that they need to be getting themselves and their clients ready for. So there are 23 very meaningful targets under the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. I won't go through all 23, but many of them are extremely relevant to the financial sector, including banking. So target 15 was called the business target, or the TNFD target, that calls for monitoring, assessing, and transparently disclosing risks, dependencies, and impacts on biodiversity. So this calls on companies and financial institutions, particularly large and transnational companies and financial institutions, to disclose these risks. So we should expect jurisdictions to be legislating to this effect, so bringing TNFD type assessment and disclosure into regulation in major jurisdictions, covering most of the world's economic activity. Target 19 is also significant. It calls for a considerable growth in financing for nature and biodiversity, including from private finance, and encouraging the private sector to invest in biodiversity, including through impact funds and other instruments. Also stimulating innovative schemes like payment for ecosystem services, green bonds, biodiversity credits, and other types of instruments. And also optimizing co-benefits and synergies with climate finance for biodiversity. Target 18 deals with the removal of harmful subsidies and the financing of harmful activities. Target 16 calls for reducing pollution and unsustainable consumption, including food waste, which will be of interest to your policies. So there's much to be digested and considered in terms of what are the voluntary calls and what are the actions that are going to be regulated with the update of national biodiversity strategy and action plans in the coming year in response to this framework. Also, not actually in the framework itself, but at the COP, we had a historical announcement from Emmanuel Faber of the IFRS Foundation that the ISSB will be extending its work to natural ecosystems and just transition. So the accounting frameworks for sustainability will also be grown and updated to include these important topics. So there's quite a lot happening in this space. I won't go further, but there's going to be a lot to unpack in the weeks and months ahead.
Okay, thank you, Jessica. And of course, the United Nations system will be geared to support the implementation of this framework. And this also includes UNEP-FI. And what we just heard from you, I think there will be a lot to do for our member banks. Can you let them know how we will support them in this task?
Absolutely. So our member banks need to be getting ready to align their portfolios to the Kunming-Montreal Agreement as they have been working towards Paris alignment. So we actually have created guidance in advance of this agreement to prepare Principles for Responsible Banking signatories, working with a group of 30 of our member banks to prepare that. We will now update it with the final framework. We will have a working group of our member banks to support each other during the process and handhold those who are fast tracking to be ahead of their peers in setting portfolio-wide biodiversity targets for land, freshwater, and oceans. We also recommend that all member banks assess their dependencies and impacts on nature using the Encore tool that is freely available. We encourage you to consider piloting the TNFD beta framework, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures framework, which links to Target 15 now. And really look at your high impact sectors, and many of these are tied to food and agriculture, which are also related to emissions. Then look for new nature finance opportunities. So there seems to be a lot of wonderful proof of concepts out there. Those need to be expanded, and they need to be looking for ways to finance nature equitably so that Indigenous peoples and local communities are benefiting from new financial flows for nature. Also, every single country will be updating its national biodiversity strategy and action plan, including a new financing plan alongside with a target for private finance. So there's an opportunity to engage nationally with those processes in every single country that you operate. Now, most Principles for Responsible Banking signatories have set their first impact target on climate. You can also look for opportunities to leverage finance for nature linked to nature-based solutions to climate. So there's a lot of work ahead, but we are definitely here to handhold with all of our member banks. We're also going to be having regular exchanges with other platforms like the Principles for Sustainable Insurance, the Finance for Biodiversity Foundation, the Science Based Targets Network, and other to make sure that we're all moving along the same direction at pace. Many of our members are also in the Partnership for Biodiversity Accounting Fund Financials, so we will be looking for opportunities there. Now, finally, the Principles for Responsible Banking benefits from a wonderful civil society advisory body that contains a number of conservation and nature-related organizations like Conservation International, WWF, Share Action, and IFRS Foundation. Given that the framework also mentions Indigenous peoples 18 times, we will also be looking at how the civil society advisory body could be strengthened by bringing in the views of Indigenous peoples.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jessica. So we will, as before at Unify, bring together this largest community of sustainable bankers worldwide and work together to shape guidance for the global financial sector on how to play a key role in achieving the goals of this new agreement on biodiversity, and very specifically on how to set and deliver targets to align their business with these biodiversity goals. Jessica, thank you very much for your time, for sharing with us the implications of this new global biodiversity framework for the financial industry in general, and the signatories of the Principles for Responsible Banking in particular. And for all of you, follow Unify on our social media channels to stay up to date with our information on banking and biodiversity, and let us know if you have questions or comments. Thank you, and see you soon.
The examples and case studies from the last segment showed us how private sector finance is starting to shift. Let's step back for a moment and start to reimagine what nature-positive finance might look like. Prepare to be inspired by innovations from the Biodiversity Finance Initiative. Discover finance mechanisms and embark on a journey to reimagine the global finance system.
Our planet, our home. It is a place of extraordinary beauty and remarkable diversity. From the tiniest microorganisms to the largest creatures ever to draw breath, human life as we know it depends on them all. The value of nature to humankind is priceless, yet we have spent far too long taking without giving back, without protecting and preserving. The problem is not a lack of money. The world is richer than ever. The problem is making sure we spend the money in the right way, the smart way. That is why the Biodiversity Finance Initiative, or BioFin, exists. It is a global initiative of the United Nations Development Programme to demonstrate how the economy and the environment are inseparable. That finance can be a force for good. That we can cut poverty and secure long-term growth while still protecting our planet. This video will show you our process for creating biodiversity finance plans and how these plans unearth long-term solutions for nature-positive economies. BioFin is already at work in more than 40 countries around the globe, forging partnerships with national governments, local communities, and the private sector. BioFin is helping to identify and secure the finances needed to preserve the natural world. The start of any journey is knowing where to begin. A policy and institutional review establishes the existing conditions in a country, and it analyses what factors may be driving biodiversity loss, such as subsidies that are harming nature. The Biodiversity Expenditure Review. This can reveal the biodiversity investments already being made by governments, the private sector and civil society in areas like agriculture, fisheries and tourism. Next, the Financial Needs Assessment calculates the overall financial resources required to achieve biodiversity goals. Then, it identifies where funding shortfalls are limiting progress. Step 4 brings all this information together to create a biodiversity finance plan. This is a long-term comprehensive strategy to catalyse investments in nature and reduce harmful practices. These cover a mix of solutions, such as results-based budgeting, increasing revenue for protected areas, and repurposing of harmful subsidies. Four steps. Each builds on the last. Together, they form a roadmap to renewal. But there's a vital fifth step a country must take. Lasting change only happens when the ideas underpinning Biofin become embedded, when they become part of the fabric of government and the private sector. Through Biofin, we can drive the investment needed to protect the natural world and improve human well-being. We can create better jobs and opportunities, and we can secure a more sustainable future for us all. The health of our economy and our planet go hand in hand. It's time, for all our sakes, that they worked together.
My name is Seth Seamus, and I am Managing Director at Eco Agriculture Partners, and I am also co-lead of the Finance Solutions Design Team, the 1,000 Landscapes for 1 Billion People initiative. And my work focuses on integrated landscape finance.
My name is Tracy Cumming. I work with the UNDP Biofin program, Biodiversity Finance Initiative. We help countries around the world develop national biodiversity finance plans and implement a range of finance solutions.
A landscape can be defined by the people who live there and their common set of challenges. So a landscape can be defined ecologically or culturally or jurisdictionally, but the point is that the people from all walks of life and whole of society need to work together in order to solve common challenges. So it's sort of this jointly defined space.
It's where there's enough connectedness for some kind of cohesion at that scale and to make real impact on the ground at that scale. And I completely agree with that. I also think the landscape approach can be applied at other scales and still really help to change huge problems. The landscape approach fundamentally looks at complexity and tries to solve multiple problems together. And doing that at the global scale, just bringing that thinking and those principles into the global scale to say we're not just trying to solve poverty or climate change or biodiversity or gender inequality. We need to figure this out as one complex system at the global level and the national level, and then at a slightly smaller landscape level. Just that thinking can be incredibly powerful and is kind of the only way we're going to really solve big problems.
I think that the challenges for finance for I'll call it integrated landscape management. I mean, there are a set of challenges. There's the challenge of financing the landscape partnership itself to bring together stakeholders, to gather data together, to be a platform for planning and negotiation. So that in of itself is a financial need.
Firstly, this funding, the actual coordination team, and that sort of platform that holds that dialogue and brings those people together, which is incredibly important, is difficult to fund. I find in general, more like ODA, public sector funding, generally would kind of support that because they understand the complexity of that. Private sector funding, I think it's a lot more appealing to fund, trackers for rhino than it is to fund people to hold workshops. It's harder to sell. You can't put that on a billboard. So I think it is finding funding for that team to run the whole thing is tough. I think some funding streams aren't integrated. So, one entity is going to be really keen on water provision, another on nature for nature, another one just on climate. And if you're trying to build integrated projects to fund, you might not always tick the right boxes. And then the third thing, again, as I said, some of these are not just about landscape approaches, but when you are trying to do this sort of bottom-up project approach, you are inherently dealing with people who don't have a background in fundraising and in knowing where to look and in knowing how to frame the argument and the right words that are going to trigger the right donors to give the right amount of money. So it can be harder, especially if you haven't dealt with the first problem, which is you don't have a good team holding this whole approach from start to finish.
Most simply, a landscape project is one which is nested in a sort of locally defined, legitimate planning process. I would, if it is a priority from that, I would call it a landscape project. So in that sense, you could have an identical tree planting project in one place. It would be the same thing in another place, but because it was prioritized by this group along with another set of activities, you could call it a landscape project.
So tree planting as an idea could be landscape approach or not. It's landscape approach if firstly you start with your landscape map and you figure out where the right place is to plant trees, not just the first place you could think of to plant trees. So where's the right place that makes sense for this entire landscape to plant trees? And secondly, you're looking at co-benefits generally because you're dealing with an integrated approach. So are you planting trees that sequester carbon, but not just sequester carbon, but also help to manage catchment? And also, are you planting indigenous trees so that your natural corridors are being supported rather than having exotic or even worse, exotic and invasive trees that are great for carbon capture, but awful for the natural environment? And then who's planting the trees? Are you bringing in an outside team to plant the trees, or are you employing locally because that is the vision of the landscape community? Are you employing locally and creating jobs locally through this tree planting project? So it's not, is tree planting the right project or not. It's how you go about that process.
Integrated landscape finance is the practice of getting funding for the priorities of landscape partnerships. In simple terms, what that means in practice is that the action plan of these landscape partnerships, this set of activities that is meant together to help this landscape meet its vision for transformation, transformation ecologically, economically, socially, that vision is like specific things. It's not just, we want to repair this riparian, area. It's like more specific. It's like, okay, there are these 50 kilometers right here of this riparian area, and this is what's possible in the place. Here's some commercial investment of agroforestry that could help us restore it. But here, this really has to be kind of a government, this has to be a park, specific actions that require all kinds of financing.
Money in is never going to solve the problem on its own. It's about the economic systems and the fiscal incentives and the way the financial market works. That whole enabling framework, it's how that needs to change so that we stop harming nature with our economies, and we stop harming nature because our legislative framework doesn't work and we're not incentivizing the right behavior, and we're getting money in to do the work we need to do.
The Mount Mulanje Trust in Malawi is working to expand its mandate. It's been sort of worked of traditional conservation trusts in the past, but it is taking over like a management concession or planning to, which would may really make it more into a landscape partnership than it had been in the past. And they're interested in not just sort of more traditional conservation activities, but more livelihood activities that integrate with conservation objectives. And they're very well positioned to do this. They already have a very inclusive governance board that includes, traditional authorities and local government agencies and research institutions and conservation institutions and private sector. And they have developed a integrated management plan for this trust. There are also a variety of activities that have been going on there for a while they'd like to scale up, or they have new ideas they want to start up. So this is a wide set of activities. So this includes hydropower development, ecotourism, sustainable timber production, fruit trees, seed nurseries, other kinds of horticulture, bee production, aquaponics, carbon credits from efficient cook stoves or electric cook stoves, water utility upgrades. And these activities come out of their integrated management plan. An important lesson that I've learned as I've engaged directly with landscape partnerships as they've tried to develop finance strategies and fund them is really how important the enabling environment is. I mean, this is to bring this conversation a bit full circle. But it will not be as simple as coming up with sort of a perfect financing solution. It is a really complicated, governance, economic, societal issue to support this kind of work. So it requires changes in the way that financial institutions function, but honestly, it requires changes in the way that even like, this will sound grandiose, but sort of people think about the world, like in kind of rather than thinking just through sectors of like, I'm a water person or I'm a climate change person. There's a lens, there's an integrated lens that I think that needs to be more widely adopted for this all to work.
And we're going to see change coming from that grassroots movement, I think. And that's really powerful. It's slow.
change is slow. Policy change is really slow. Changing bureaucracies is really slow fundamentally. But I think we're going to see it because more and more people are saying we cannot do this if we're not more integrated.
Hello and welcome to the session on Debt for Nature Swap. In this session, we will try to understand the role of Debt for Nature Swap in addressing the gaps in financing for nature conservation and its overall contribution to development. To help understand this, today I have invited three guests. First, we have Midori Paxton, Director of UNDP's Nature Hub. Welcome, Midori. So may I request you to formally open this session, and could you also please take a moment to explain Debt for Nature Swap's role in addressing the financing for nature gap, especially vis-a-vis Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework Target 19?
It's a pleasure for me to open this Nature for Life Hub event and sharing this space with an impressive lineup of experts. I'm really looking forward to discussing opportunities for the use of innovative financing instruments for nature. With the biodiversity finance gap estimated at $700 billion per year, generating finance and improving the management of existing finances for conservation of nature is a clear priority. But beyond the funding gap, we should also look at the underlying economic drivers and recognize the need to increase and redirect public investment and encourage reforms for fiscal sustainability. The newly agreed Global Biodiversity Framework reinforces this paradigm by placing at its heart the explicit call to substantially and progressively increase the level of financial resources from all sources by 2030. In particular, Target 19 of the Global Biodiversity Framework is a wake-up call for developed countries to increase the total biodiversity-related international financial resources to developing countries, and particularly least developed countries and small island developing states, to at least $30 billion per year by 2030. To achieve this target, countries will also need to look at reforming their fiscal space. With the economic impacts of COVID-19 pandemic, in addition to lacking external finance, developing country governments are reducing domestic funding for climate and nature-related programs because of their high debt service obligations. Sustainability-linked debt instruments, including debt for nature swaps, can be transformative solutions for accelerating nature conservation, while at the same time contributing to reducing sovereign debt burdens. For countries confronted with the dual challenges of greater sovereign debt distress exacerbated by global shocks, debt restructuring, which is linked to nature, can be an effective tool to allocate funds to achieve biodiversity outcomes, and therefore a core driver of a green and inclusive recovery.
Thank you, Midori. That was super helpful. Next, I have Connie Wigneraza, UNDP's Assistant Administrator and Director of the Regional Bureau for Asia and the Pacific. Welcome to the learning session, Connie. Could you please help us understand how can we reduce pressure on the natural world while ensuring economic stability and human development? And what role Debt for Nature Swap can play while addressing this challenge?
That is such a key question, and we should be asking and responding to it in all locations. So let's look at the evidence. This year, 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries have been breached, pushing our Earth beyond being a continued safe space for us to live in. So putting both people and planet at the center of our approach, UNDP is looking at short-term and long-term actions that align fiscal and environmental sustainability, or should I say responsibility. Now, one innovative instrument that is rapidly evolving in this space is the Debt for Nature swap, or DNS for short. So how can we further explore together what this instrument does and what does the evidence show us? It shows that one must engage all the key stakeholders, government, the donors, who design and structure, those who design and structure these DNS instruments, to get on the same page on both nature conservation and responsible economic progress and show that it can happen together. The interest is growing, as we have seen the scale with which this started off with a 21 million deal in 2015 for the seashells, and the most recent being a 1.6 billion debt conversion in Ecuador, which happened this year. Now, the overall impact on debt sustainability is still limited, but recent DNS transactions in Belize and Ecuador show that it can reduce the debt burden by around 10% of GDP, and that is significant. Development financing instruments are testing guarantees and pause clauses to facilitate cheaper finance for distressed countries. So a DNS cannot work as a standalone instrument, but best works as part of a larger debt restructure effort. In the Asia Pacific, lessons are emerging from countries like Lao PDR, Pakistan, the Maldives, and Fiji, who are seriously considering this instrument as part of their overall approach to debt sustainability. So let me leave you with 3 takeaways. First, recent transactions are showing scalability with the increasing role of bilateral and multilateral creditors and their financing institutions. Second, a debt for nature swap is not a standalone and should complement other financial instruments that reduce the cost of borrowing. And third, involving emerging creditors in our region like China and India is a must, and they must be urged to further explore this field and engage. UNDP is ready to further support this work and to facilitate among the stakeholders to make sure countries that engage on innovative solutions to address their current debt situations and their future debt burden look at addressing both fiscal and environmental distress and move it from distress to a responsible way forward to build a much more sustainable future.
Thank you, Connie. Debt for nature swap seems to play a crucial role in reducing the debt burden while addressing the nature crisis. Thank you for joining us today, Connie. Dear participant, as you heard from Connie, several DNS have already been completed. Let's try to look at one of these deals with our next guest. Our next guest is Gregory Watson, the Principal Specialist for Biodiversity and Natural Capital, Climate Change and Sustainable Development for Inter-American Development Bank. Thank you for taking the time to join us, Greg. Could you please share Inter-American Development Bank's experience on debt for nature swap?
The IDB is the partner of choice in Latin America and the Caribbean, and a key global player supporting the growth, transparency, efficiency, equity, and development of the sustainable finance capital markets agenda in the region. The bank generates cutting-edge knowledge and provides technical assistance, supports policy development for governments, and supports the implementation of innovative solutions. This work is grounded in years of collaboration and fruitful engagement with governments, financial institutions, and civil society. Using IDB's financial instruments, such as policy-based guarantees and loans, in new ways to support countries on their development paths is vital to optimizing MDB balance sheets and modernizing the international financial system. The Barbados and Ecuador debt for nature conversion transactions are cases in point. In Barbados, the IDB supported the transaction with a guarantee of US $100 million, which included hurricane and pandemic clauses, and a policy matrix with triggers that supported the financial and environmental policies of both the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Environment and National Beautification. This created the enabling environment for implementation success. The IDB also supported the negotiation of conservation commitments and the creation of Conservation Trust Fund that channels the net transactions resources. The bank is also further supporting the government through technical assistance for developing a marine spatial planning process that underpins conservation commitments and that will support a draft ocean policy. In Ecuador, the Debt for Nature conversion was not only the largest operation of its kind, but it marked the first time that a multilateral institution combined guarantees with political risk insurance to mobilize resources from different actors towards conservation. The impact is noteworthy in supporting economic and social reactivation based on conservation and sustainable use of natural capital. The transaction helped to protect an important area of open ocean near the Galapagos, created a new conservation trust fund, and had important policy commitments around fishery regulation. The bank is committed to improving lives and to continue to advance innovation in financial markets in collaboration with all stakeholders. Building on successful partnership with UNDP in different areas, from Uruguay sustainability-linked bonds to the common framework of sustainable finance taxonomies for Latin America and the Caribbean, we look forward to collaborate on our conservation-related plans in Latin America with UNDP and with other partners, in particular to conserve flagship species such as jaguars. To conclude, protecting biodiversity is not just an investment in our planet's future. It's an ethical responsibility and a smart economic decision. The urgency of addressing biodiversity loss and climate change cannot be overstated.
Thank you. That was super informative. Well, folks, there you have it. It seems that DNS definitely provides an opportunity to address the nature financing gap, reduce sovereign debt, and serve as a mechanism to address the development challenges. I'll be back in the next Nature for Life Hub event with more information on DNS trends, other innovative financing mechanisms, success stories, and lesson learned. Until then, thank you for watching.
This brings us to the conclusion of the first part of our exploration of delivering a nature-based economy. Stay with us. We'll be back in just a few moments for part 2 to take a closer look at business and finance transformations.